Good morning, friends and new acquaintances. I'm Stephen Chiu, co-director of the Academy of Hong Kong Studies. On behalf of the Academy, let me extend my warmest welcome to everyone who has taken the trouble to come to this remote corner of Hong Kong. I thought Tai Lok is tied up elsewhere, but apparently he just want to give me something to do this morning. In this world of global connectedness, sometimes it's easy to forget the importance of physical distance. So really appreciate all of you who took the trouble to come here today. And of course, in this, again, time of millions of Zoom conferences and meetings, it's nice to have a change and come out for a face-to-face event like this one. For the past few years, I think this is the 5th year of the annual studies conference, annual Hong Kong Studies Conference, and it has been, I would say, the labor of love for the review panel members to come together every year, you know, in a night these days in Mong Kok to go through the papers that we have selected and nominated to see who should get the accolade for this year. And our job has been made a little bit more difficult by the sheer volume of work that could be possibly classified as Hong Kong studies. So much so that we have to expand the size of our review panel to get more help to cope with the volume of work that we have. For some of us among us, will say that this is the new dawn for Hong Kong studies, epitomed by the much larger volume of work that has been published in very reputable venues, international journals, that our big brass in at the university senior management will like. You know, in the old days, it's hard to imagine a lot of the works that has been published in the past few years could be published in those international journals. So for this, I believe this is one of the high tide, at least, for Hong Kong studies. But on the other hand, there will be others who say that, well, given the kind of new normal that we found ourselves in Hong Kong now, it could be the last hurrah. We don't know, some would say that we don't know how much room we still have to pursue some of the topics that we have been doing. And I overheard some of the discussion of switching to history, maybe, instead of political science. But of course, only time will tell whether this is going to be the last hurrah or new dawn for Hong Kong studies. Today, we all come here to celebrate the exceptional qualities of the award papers for this year and come to learn a little bit more about how much we know more about the community that we all love here. Okay, thank you again, and we hope to I will just stop here and move on to the presentation and hope you enjoy the proceedings today. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me to have a chance to moderate this first session of the annual conference of Academy of Hong Kong Studies. In this panel, Dr. Winnie Yi will speak on the topic relateralizing lateral tropes, thinking through eco-critical discourse in post-handover Hong Kong. And Dr. Winnie Yi is Program Director of the Master of Arts in Literary and Cultural Studies at the University of Hong Kong. She was a fellow in Rachel Carson Center for the Environment and Society at Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. Her research interests are eco-criticism, contemporary Chinese literature and film, Hong Kong culture, Asian independent cinema, and post-colonial theories. And Winnie is currently working on a book project exploring the relationship between eco-poetic Chinese literature and independent film scene in Hong Kong. This is a very timely paper that engages an important topic in the field of eco-criticism, especially as the paper was written when the interconnectedness of the globe is evident in the pandemic. More importantly, this is not a simple application of eco-critical theory to the topic, but an attempt to rediscover how this might lead to a renewed understanding of the role of eco-criticism in illuminating the condition of a city such as Hong Kong. In this essay, Winnie examined some of the central lateral symbols, such as the barren rock of the city, that have shaped the grand narrative of Hong Kong from an eco-critical perspective, leading to an original cross-fertilization of eco-critical, historical, cultural, and social discourses in the paper. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Winnie Yi.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen, for these very generous introductions. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the review panel, of Hong Kong's Studies Annual Conference for including my paper, as one of the outstanding papers. It is really a honor, to be here to learn, from other outstanding scholars, and also to know, we are all dedicated, to Hong Kong studies. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Stephen Chin Kyu Chen, because he's the one, who included my paper in his special issue in cultural studies. For me, my paper, titled "Denaturalizing Natural Tropes: Thinking Through Eco-Critical Discourse in Post-Handover Hong Kong." Okay, so this is for me a immediate response and also a long-term observation to what's happening in Hong Kong in the summer of 2019, but also in a longer history about storytelling. And I think maybe we all have vivid memories about this saying that Hong Kong is no longer the same. That has been sort of like heard everywhere since the summer of 2019. This statement, of course, reflects the drastic changes in Hong Kong politics that have led, to the restraint of freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and other rights. But then, for me, it is still important to think about, Hong Kong is no longer the same from a wider and a longer perspective, in order to have a better understanding what has actually changed and how those changes should be read and understood. Hong Kong's story, has been predominated, by a progressive model and also a developmental discourse, shaping, not just the framework of our historical records, but also the way we imagine, our city and our identity. This story, of a small fishing village, developed, from nothing to something, from absence, to presence, from inferiority to quasi-dominance, has, need to be examined, anew, about this validity and also the kind of cultural image, that emerged, from it. So if we sort of like look back, in history, well, of course, in this letter, dated April 21st, 1841, Lord Palmerston, the then Foreign Secretary of Great Britain, wrote, to Charles Eliot and describing Hong Kong as such, and I quote here: "It is with great regret that I express to you my extreme disappointment at your negotiations for devoting energy to gain a barren island with hardly a house upon it, that had no chance of even being a great mart of trade." And the Charles Eliot, the then superintendent of British trade in China, was also sort of like scolded, by Queen Victoria, because Hong Kong was considered as unfavorable spot for trade between the West and the Qing government. And this reference, to barren rock and the complete dismissal, of indigenous habitats, were quite typical of imperialism. But then, this sort of like, lack of interest, in the indigenous habitats and marginalizing the city is also echoed, by the motherland at the time. The marginality, of the city in terms of the motherland was also viewed unfavorably. So Hong Kong Island, and the Kowloon Peninsula and the New Territories were ceded, at the end, of the 19th century, and serving as a refuge for immigrants during the periods of social unrest in mainland China. The colony was condemned, by the elite as a place of decadence and vulgarity, sorely in need of education in appropriate patriotism to the motherland. So in a way, Hong Kong is enduring, a double colonization, first due to its geographical location, and second due to the motherland's image of its citizens. So I'm looking here, in my paper, this idea of naturalization. So all colonizers use repressive measures to demean the colonized, but in Hong Kong, the naturalization and its repression of identity was undertaken by both the colonizer and the motherland. And the term naturalization evokes, the natural world, which needs to be tamed, and likewise, the colonized, needs to be tamed. Natural tropes were appropriated by both the British colonizers and substantiated, by the motherland, and in the case of Hong Kong. And these natural tropes, was gradually, faded away as Hong Kong become sort of subsumed, in the urban narrative. But it's interesting to see how these natural tropes have revived, in the post-handover as part of the larger discussions of climate change and the future of the city. So that is what I am doing in my paper, is to recuperate, the eco-critical approaches, to reflect on these natural tropes, that have been predominated, in the discussions and understanding, of Hong Kong. So liberating nature from anthropocentric projections became a way for me, and also for a lot of eco-critics, for the former colony to reassert, its agency, to view the landscape and seascape as participant in historical processes rather than backdrops to human experience would allow for more complex epistemology that, I quote here, recuperates the authority of both history and nature without reducing either the other, end quote. So it is instructive to think of and to examine how nature has been recuperated in the post-handover period and the way that it becomes a means of imagining a different or maybe a more hopeful, future. So my paper, looks at 3 natural tropes that have been widely used in public discourse and cultural texts when referring to Hong Kong. So these 3 tropes, include the barren rock, the seaport, and the bauhinia, the city flower. The natural tropes I will be discussing in the paper, illustrate a return to nature in both pragmatic and symbolic ways, which I think will contribute, to a new methodological approach to understanding and framing the discourse on Hong Kong, how it has been perceived and how it can be, reimagined. So I will start, with the first natural trope, which is the barren rock. The description of barren rock was first used, by Charles Eliot, the English commissioner who was eager to use Hong Kong as a strategic port for importing opium and tea leaves in the 1840s. This particular symbol of rock, on the contrary, was used to portray Hong Kong as a place of nothingness. By bestowing this label, the colonizer claimed the right to cultivate, to civilize, to change, modify, and even to shape the place. It also strategically restarts the clock of Hong Kong history from the point of colonization, eliminating any pre-colonial history. The symbol is registered and eliminated in the same time. So commercial development will determine the usage of land, and any other connections with the land are of no importance, according to the colonizer. So I'm appropriating, eco-critical approaches to do, my analysis. And in the field of material eco-criticism, the agency of matter is represented in 2 ways. The first focus on the way matter is described and represented in narrative text, literary, cultural, visual. And the second focus on matter's narrative power, which generates meaning that intersect with human concern. So the debunking of human stories and the return to land's materiality encourage an alternative way of reflecting the narratives of Hong Kong. And matter, here becomes a site of narrativity, embodying its own narrative in the minds of human agents and the very structure of its own constructive forces. So interpret in this material eco-critical light, matter itself also becomes a text. And by examining the ways in which barren rocks gradually become a site of narrativity and mutual respect, I think we can gain a renewed understanding of our relationship with land and also liberated it, from the assumptions of historical discourse. And other examples, from history to reconfirm in the way that Hong Kong is being doubly marginalized is when we read Chinese elite Wang Tao's the way he recorded the first impression of Hong Kong. He noted, and I quote here and also in the PowerPoint slide, Hong Kong was originally a barren isle. There's very little flat land between the mountains and the sea, whereas a few yards altogether. End quote. This barren rock image conveyed a kind of antipathy, for Hong Kong's marginality and lack of civilization. He continues, to recall, the afternoon of the next day I arrived in Hong Kong. The hills all around are rather bare of trees, and nothing but water meets the eyes. The people appear rather stupid and speak a dialect that is quite unintelligible. The experience was exuberating when I first arrived, and I felt and I could hardly stand it. So I think Wang Tao laid down, a sort of like biased, impression on Hong Kong that, quite a lot, of literary writers who came, from mainland China later, also pick up on. So for many Chinese, writers, Hong Kong was, of course, inferior, to Asian China, lacking its history and grandeur. So this marginalized of Hong Kong is integral to what can be called a Central Plains, syndrome, which is part of this centralizing anti-imperialist state-building discourse that underlying the 20th century representation of Chinese culture. So again, the land is being deprived of its history. The inhabitants cannot claim, their particularity. And given that the rock, has no intrinsic value of its own, so all values must be imposed, by external forces, both the colonizer and the motherland. I think, this idea, of the rock, gradually, changes, and then probably, we have to go back, to the 1960s, to understand, how this rock, is being endowed, with a different, meanings, and in what way this continued to sort of like provoke, different kind of imaginations, of the land. So I think Hong Kong people, gained a more prominent local identity in the aftermath of the 1967 riots, which of course, compelled the British government to introduce a series of reforms that would strengthen the local, attachment. So I think that could be quite familiar to many of us, in the room. And that, kind of autonomy, certain kind of autonomy that was enabled, by the sort of like opportunities in the post-World War II period and the growth of the free market, actually also has a very important influence, on the post-war media culture that was cosmopolitan and political in nature. So I think that autonomy also effectively created kind of competing imagined communities at the time, which is based on mentalities and lifestyle that was divided on the class and educations. So it is interesting to see how the rock is being appropriated by the mass media in the 1960s and later, especially by this very important TV productions Below the Lion Rock. By RTHK in the 1970s, which depicts, the everyday life, of the Hong Kong people. The location of the Lion Rock is emblematic as it is diametrically opposed, to that of the Victoria Harbour, which represents sort of like the central district, spirit, with its iconic skyline and the peak. And Lion Rock, in contrast, is more representative of the majority, of the Hong Kong people. So Below the Lion Rock, was one of these most popular TV series at the time, and prompted, the phrase of Lion Rock spirit that celebrate the perseverance, of Hong Kong people. But then the show's theme song is often revived, by the HKSAR government at times of emergency or crisis. So if Lion Rock, has a spirit, it is that life is hard, but one can always, overcome. This idea of the rock as a symbol, of empowerment. It is not simply what it represents that matters for me, but the way we allow the rock, the materiality of nature, represent us. There is a powerful interdependence between the materiality that looking at the rock as a backbone of Hong Kong and an icon of endurance, and the spirituality of a communal self, one that relies on such a symbol to define the value of existence. So the rock is a source of inspiration and the backbone of a developing social self, and also an essential site of engagement. And Lion Rock, of course, has become a particularly powerful trope, not as a distant object of representation, but as a site of resistance. It entered sort of like into the history of Hong Kong when a huge flag emblazoned with the demand, "I want genuine universal suffrage," was affixed to it on October 23rd in the year of 2014 during the Umbrella Movement. In this line, I have this quote, from Professor Megan Morris, who wrote and sort of celebrated, the fact that the rock has become part of Hong Kong's people's, identity. Megan Morris, so I wouldn't, so you can just read here that Morris, talks about that the first time, when this flag, is being hung, on the Lion Rock, brought tears, to her eyes for the courage and imaginative daring of the young rock climbers, the Spidey, who climb and show, their strong support, to a universal, suffrage. Megan Morris later actually refers, to the Spidey action as an oddity, and so is the Lion Rock. Located opposite the Hong Kong Island's Victoria Peak, the Lion Rock, here, with the New Territories and then China behind it as one of those Hong Kong midway border zones that signify mediation and transgression, not least in terms of its significance today as a contexted collective myth of popular social solidarity on the one, and entrepreneurial values on the other, end of quote. The banner was a pioneering and groundbreaking act that echoed the action taking place in the occupation zones at the time. Against the traditional image of Hong Kong as an apolitical society devoted to making money, the performative act on the Lion Rock highlighted a commitment to the democratic system that is promised, by the Basic Law. The act of the Hong Kong Spidey helped, to forge, the identity of Hong Kong in the post-handover era. And this ritual of climbing the Lion Rock as a form of protest has strengthened the relationship between nature and Hong Kong people through this engagement, with the materiality and embodied in the experience. And in summer of 2019, a statue of the Liberty Goddess was temporarily placed on the Lion Rock to show the determination of the protesters against, the imposition of the anti-extradition bill. The other examples, that sort of like reinstate the importance of land in Hong Kong can be found in what I term as the eco-critical turn of a group of farmers who look to the land to provide an alternative future for Hong Kong. It sort of like stemmed, from this Save Chow Yun Village movement back in 2009, which is about the construction of a railway line between Hong Kong and Shenzhen. So there's need, to evacuate a small village that leads, to a very, fierce, discussions about, how to use the land, how to respect, the indigenous people who farms, for a living. And so because of that, there is actually a lot of organic communities and organic farmlands that were emerged, out of that protest back in 2009. And for me, this eco-turn has turned attention to agriculture, a long neglected sector of Hong Kong that has been left out, from the mainstream narrative of the region. The sustainable way of living that they promoted out, of that movement also symbolized, solidarity with marginalized workers across East Asia and served as a warning against, overdevelopment. And this return, to the land represent a shift, from viewing land as a barren rock and an object of economic speculation to recognizing it as a living agent. And their way of life offers an alternative, to the long-established, urban model. So for me, this post-materialist way of living sits a balance, of development and sustainability, and also as an escape, from the burden of the economic image that defined Hong Kong since its very beginning. Now I will move, to the second natural trope, which is water, the waterscape. The identity of Hong Kong as a port actually has been gradually erased, by the government that has been intent, on urban development. But it's, of course, historically, the story of Hong Kong is always a maritime tale. At the Maritime Museum of Hong Kong, we are told that, and I cited here, that one of the first mentions of Hong Kong can be found in an ancient maritime map that appeared in the Ming Dynasty Yue Daji, the big record of Guangdong by Guo Fei, which was published in the 24th year of Wan Li. Hong Kong has a natural border that is deep enough to shelter ships from the northeast wind in winter and the southwest monsoon in summer. So that's why, Westerners trading in Guangzhou had knowledge of this island of Hong Kong and its anchorage, since the late 17th century. So this is the historical background. But I think, more important than this geographical dimensions, it is the symbolic associations of water in Hong Kong. This is the flowing and floating that characterize both the natural landscape of the city and also its inhabitants. Hong Kong is a passageway, for many sojourners and migrants who later played a significant role in Hong Kong's political and economic life. The port facilitates the circulation of products, ideas, and also during the colonial rule, the compradors, moved between locals and colonizers, traversing boundaries both geographical and ideological. And a very prominent example, of that flexible spirit, of Hong Kong is film industry. At the turn of the 20th century, movies, were supposed to be apolitical, and the colonial government, was not interested in using the media for war propaganda. But the Cantonese cinema was criticized quite frequently by the Chinese intelligentsia, for hindering the state-building project by promoting, a local dialect, as well as alternative imaginations of collective identity. But then Hong Kong cinema, has flourished because it has managed to remain free, from this moral burden and emotional, urgency. But then, being able, to adapt to external changes and situations has been quite crucial, for Hong Kong filmmakers, especially since globalization. And I use this example to highlight that kind of floating and that emphasis, on movement and flexibility. If we look at more recent events, the closer economic partnership agreement offer a safety net, and the PRC became vital to the survival of Hong Kong cinema in the 1990s. As a result of CIPA, Hong Kong mainland co-productions were considered national films, so they no longer needed to compete for place among the limited quota of imported films. To some critics, in order to please the Chinese audience, Hong Kong cinema, I quote, became lost, in transition with the one vigorous film and music industry that were driving forces of Hong Kong's economy, as well as sources of cultural identity in decay, end of quote. That is from Megan Morris. And Stephen Chu also shared a similar lament, in his discussion of the rise of China and its impact on the strategy of the Hong Kong government to position itself, and hence, quote, the blow dealt to the development of Hong Kong culture during the 15 years after the handover, end quote. Now, even though this uniqueness of Hong Kong cinema is being criticized, as losing its aura, the power of film continues to flow in the making of Hong Kong identity in a different context, showcasing the empowerment of both the materiality of nature, but also the symbolic power of popular culture. Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like water. Bruce Lee's advice, became the most often quoted slogan of the Hong Kong protesters in the summer of 2019. And being water has become a tactical move, allowing protesters to adapt quickly to circumstances during confrontation. Stephen Chan, notes that through flexible and dynamic Be Water protest, the resistance movement has quickly evolved into the popular struggle for upholding, Hong Kongers' core values and ways of life. So the question I may have, is being water Hong Kong's new strategy of negotiation with the PRC? Amid the increasing anxiety and anger, towards the loss of autonomy and the broken promises, Hong Kong people have become utterly disillusioned. The Be Water strategy is based on the need to adjust, swiftly, to be able, to submerge, emerge, disperse, as required, and to be flexible, while exhausting all available, possibilities. And interestingly, if we reflect on this idea of flexibility, it has always acquired kind of negative connotations in the context of Hong Kong. Being flexible can be read as a lack of commitment to any values or principles. So you're free, to choose, decide whatever you see fit and convenient. But then this meaning, however, does not apply when flexibility, is shown to be the means by which the weak can confront, the powerful. Akbar Abbas, point out that the movement initiated, by the crowd, itself, is a power, and a crowd is also being given a sense, of belonging in movement. So, and I quote here: more than for rhetoric of nationalism and the nation form, it would seem that it is now the crowd that gives people an actual sense of belonging, and it's at its height. An estimated 2 million Hong Kong citizens from all walks of life and income levels took to the streets. And this is, end of quote. And it's not just the presence of bodies, but their movement as well. So the Human Chain event, which marks, the 30th anniversary of the Baltic Way, demonstrate, the desire, of the people for independence and solidarity. And the Human Chain demonstrates, the empathy and community that also characterize, the Hong Kong protests in the summer, 2019. I argue that, by relating to the suffering, of others, through, that movement, it is believed that the collective subjectivity can be shaped, through that shared affect, in presence and in public spaces. So this is, yeah. So the human chain was a spectacular performance that required body exposure and movement in the public spaces, and except which, from a new materials point of view, it generates meaning in the ongoing performances of the world in this differential intelligibility. And movement in space not only give meaning to space, but also allow bodies to be shaped by space and other bodies in the same time. So new affective bonding is enabled in this movement of coexistence and interactions. So the human chain allowed this body to be actualized in the event and also redefine the meaning of public spaces. No one could have actually imagined the potential of the event when it was first initiated, but then the empowerment that came from its originality and novelty. And I think that also supports Judith Butler's theory of importance of visible bodies, when Judith Butler celebrates the body's right to act. And her main contention is when bodies assemble public to give form to a particular set of aspirations, they actually affirm a plural and performative right to appear that expresses a bodily demand for novel social, political, and economic arrangements no longer afflicted by any induced form of precarity. So I will quickly, move, to the third natural trope, which is Bauhinia, the city flower. The flower was chosen to be the city icon of Hong Kong back in 1965. And on July 1st, 1997, when Hong Kong returned to the Chinese sovereignty, it became the regional emblem of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and also featured on Hong Kong's coin, where it replaced the Queen's profile. And it also became one of the watermarks of Hong Kong's banknote. I quoted here, is actually from Robert Beckham, also a colleague, from Hong Kong U, who described, actually the origin, of this flower, which was first, discovered in the 1980s in Pak Fu Lam in Hong Kong's Western District. It was introduced, then to the botanical gardens, where its profuse and persistent flowering was noted by the superintendent of the garden. Later, it had been planted as an ornamental flowering plant across the colony. So it is interesting to see that it is actually an imposition of the colonizers rather than it's an inherent in the space of Hong Kong. So due to its unknown and unclassified origin, the plant is often assumed to have been imported by the colonizer. The two key features of Bauhinia are its sterility, it does not produce seeds or fruits, and its hybridity. It is a cross between a Bauhinia variegate and Bauhinia purpura, the two different types of Bauhinia. As such, it is representative, of Hong Kong's awkward sense of displacement. Hong Kong was a site overtaken by British colonizers for purely monetary purposes and abandoned, by the motherland due to its contamination. So the flower's hybridity is also associated often, with impurity and considered as a bad omen. Its next category, is reflected in the poor condition of Hong Kong's countryside, which is continually threatened, by urbanization, and its inability, to bear fruit symbolize the city's infertility and its continued dependency on both its former colonizer and the motherland. So this idea of sterility is also supported by quite a lot of Chinese elites that look at Hong Kong as a cultural desert. So Hong Kong, is not just on the margin, but then it's being understood, as incapable, of producing, its own culture or embracing, its own cultural values. So thinking of this notion of the flowers and its inability to produce, it's interesting to see that blossom everywhere. Another slogan of the summer of 2019 was used to mobilize multiple protests in various unexpected corners of the city at the time. An example, of that kind of activist blossoming, is evident at the Lennon Wall. Say, for example, in Hong Kong, the name was borrowed, from the war in Prague, where people post ideas, feelings, share their thoughts. This retaking of public spaces, which is akin, to a kind of graffiti, is more targeted way of spreading ideas. And in Hong Kong, blossoming occurred when public spaces became this site, of creative messaging. And the slogan is particularly powerful because blossoming has the association of pollinization, growing, and seed planting. The blossoming in Hong Kong is evident in all kinds of creative posters and slogans across the city. And this emergence of this explosion of creative power should be understood in the context of a crisis. And I'm quoting Esther Jones, in her understanding and analysis of Hong Kong theme during the period of the takeover, as crisis cinema as an example. Jones argues that, I quote, if crisis pose a threat to people's continued existence, in a given society or epoch, people create their ways of living together and their ways of presenting their collective life by the creative and symbolic dimension of the social. They can only resort to the imaginary when problems in the social historical world cannot be resolved, end quote. And I think, her point is equally applicable to the protests of 2019. This blossoming of creativity, has the advantage of visibility. The protest posters has become symbols, throughout the world, and creativity inspired by danger leads to an art that conveys the anxieties and risks of its historical moment. The realization of its transience and ephemerality suggests a chronotopic threshold where moments cannot be frozen. I would also label this creative publicity and poster and protest over a kind of visual politics in which high art and popular culture, mundane kitsch and religious symbols are all combined to bombard audience around the world. Often a parody of historical posters, there are posters, conjure shared memories that reflect the cosmopolitan identity of Hong Kong. They take a lot of inspirations, from sources as varied as Liberty Leading the People, to Star Wars, to Bruce Lee. So this ability to reference, articulate, and recycle and reinvent such a range of elements expand the poster scope and audience. The references to the cultural icons, both local and global, broadens, the meaning of the protest, in its inclusiveness, which has clearly blossomed during the protest, is provocatively, creative art. Okay, I think I will just skip this one. So I would just come to a conclusion, to my paper, and also my discussion. The three natural tropes, discussed in this article has been used to represent the conventional reading of Hong Kong, and that have been contributed, to the dominant, discourse, for a very long time. And for me, liberating these tropes, from their traditional and anthropocentric interpretations and allowing nature to triumph can be seen as a way of encouraging the former colony to reassert, its agency. To construct a different future does not mean to forget about the past. I think, Walter Benjamin, given us very, important lessons here, maintains that, liberation of the past allows for a more reasonable and productive way to imagine oneself. And he argues that the idea of now is what produced the impetus for historians to write the past, not the way that it really was, but to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at the moment of danger. The events of 2009, 2014, and 2019 created just such a moment of danger, which has led to a kind of existential crisis on the part of historians and cultural scholars, and driven them to make sense of the past. And I'm hoping, that my discussions would provoke, some kind of reimagination of Hong Kong and the storytelling, of Hong Kong, not as a site of necessarily commercial development, but as a site, of agency. That, this new interpretation of Hong Kong's traditional tropes can offer a rejuvenated reading of the post-Hong Kong, post-1997 history, as well as a signpost for its journey onwards. So thank you so much, for your attention. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wendy Yee, for your very inspiring presentation. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Q&A today, so please contact Dr. Yee after the conference, and I'm sure she will be more than happy to answer your questions.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Francis Lee from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. So I am introducing the second paper and the award winner. The award winner is Professor Donna Zhu, also from the School of Journalism and Communication of Chinese U of Hong Kong. Unfortunately, she is, because of her traveling schedule itinerary, she could not be here. But anyway, so Professor Zhu is an associate professor from our School of Journalism and Communication at Chinese U of Hong Kong, and she has been a media practitioner and documentarian for several years before joining the academia. Originally, she was and of course, she is still very much interested in research and actually the practice of media literacy education. And over the years, her research interest has extended into the study of youth culture, especially the intersection between youth culture and digital culture, and also in recent years, studies about mediated memories. And her article is actually also about mediated memories. Her article is titled "Young Journalists and Old News: Remembering Mass Protests in Hong Kong." Basically, it's an article that I would say weave together at least three major concerns in the study of collective memory: intergenerational transmission of memory, how young people take up the collective memory of a society, the role of a specific very important social institution, in this case, the news media, in the reproduction of collective memories, and also the role of critical events in a society's history. In this case, a couple of very important mass protests, the 1967 riots and the 89 protests, in shaping a society's self-understanding. So the article, the article basically addresses such a topic. Now, because Donna is not here and she has recorded her presentation. Okay, so right now I think we can turn to her recorded presentation.
Thank you, Francis, for your introduction, and good morning, colleagues. And thank you very much for your recognition. I feel much honored to be given this award. I'm sorry that I cannot join you in person today. When you're watching this video, I am on the way back to Hong Kong. So instead of getting your comments and suggestions, I will have to speak to the air for the next 30 minutes. It doesn't sound really exciting, but I'm glad that I have the chance to share with you a project I have been working on in the past few years. Today, I'm going to divide my time into three parts. First, I would talk about the general background of this study. Then I'll move on to the findings about how young journalists covered old news. I will end the presentation with some thoughts on mediated memory in the digital age. So to begin with, let's take a walk down the memory lane, a very old saying, I suppose. I have always found memory an intriguing phenomenon. Memory is fluid and non-representational. It is not a content that can be placed in our brains. So in order to get it materialized or concretized, media are involved one way or another. Memory can be rather unreliable, as things like false memory or emphasis of good old days suggest. But on the other hand, memory is very useful. We just can't live without memory because it enables us to develop a sense of coherence about ourselves. It helps to strengthen social bonds when we share memories with others, and it also gives us some direction to make sense of our inner worlds. And it is mainly the case of personal memory. When extending to collective memory, what is of interest is the impersonal, conventional, collective, and normative aspects of the process of remembering. Collective memory is certainly about history, but it is not the same as history. The fact that not all historical events will be recalled in the same way show that some memories are considered as more important than others. Every time when these memories are recalled, people engage in new rounds of meaning-making. Collective memory is therefore a product of social group, a social framework through which representations of the past could be shared. It has been found that different people recall or rank the same historical events in different ways. Here, a generational perspective is implied. Temporally speaking, collective memory is tied to the past, present, and future. It is about how the past is selected, constructed, and contested in the present. Such selection, construction, and contestation of the past, on the other hand, are often based on the changing needs of the present, meaning that collective memory is unpredictable and can be subject to reinterpretations. Collective memory is prospective as well because it is often mobilized to correct certain historical injustices, which means unresolved past events will still be recalled in the future if it remains unresolved. In short, collective memory is not something that is so natural but has to be constructed, will be contested, and how it is transmitted across generations remains a point of great interest because it speaks much about the common knowledge and experience, as well as underlying moral and aesthetic values of the community. I become very interested in the relationships between media and memory, as I realize that they do shape one another in the mediation process at three different aspects, including personal level, technological level, and also social context. More specifically, journalism plays a notable role in collective memory too, through commemorative journalism, historical analogy, and references to historical context. In commemorative journalism, for example, anniversary news coverage often constructs coherent narratives out of the contradictory and messy facts of the past, and providing tacit knowledge and a point of reference to the society in general. Here, journalists are considered to possess or to exercise cultural authority because of their abilities to order the past. And this ability also refers to in a way that they can determine what authoritative versions of the world are presented. This is how I started this research project about mediated memories. I have focused on memories of protests, mainly because they are contentious and confrontational and more impactful. Both personal memory of participants and collective memory in a society are supposed to be strong as well. So I would like to consider the roles of media in the construction, contestation, and transmission of collective memory through this particular aspect, the memories of protest. My initial plan was to look at four mass protests, 1967, 1989, 2003, and 2014. The original design was inspired by a hunch, an observation about the coincidence between the protest and the arrival of certain media technologies. For example, in 1967, the riots lasted from May to December, but the first free-to-air television channel only arrived in mid-November in the same year. So it was mainly newspapers and radio serving to report and to cover the news back then. But in 1989, television broadcasts became a living room phenomenon. So everybody was watching, not everybody, many people were watching television around the clock. Similarly, in 2003, Facebook had not yet arrived, but by the time in 2014, some people already dubbed the umbrella movement as a social media revolution. I propose to examine the roles of media in collective memory from two aspects. First, as I just mentioned, my hunch, I would like to look at how media as technologies are probably contributing to the formation of collective memory. And second, media as content producers. For this part, I have conducted two separate yet related studies. One is a content and textual analysis of the case of anniversary journalism. Another one is this paper on young journalists and old news, in which I think young journalists are memory agents, are analyzed as memory agents. Given the time and the scale, I eventually managed to focus on two protests only, the ones in 1967 and 1989. Both were considered to be very significant events in Hong Kong, as summarized in this table. So to put it very simply here, in 1967, it was a large-scale protest by Hong Kong leftists against the colonial government, in which 51 people were killed, 4,500 people were arrested, and the colonial government had to reactivate emergency regulations in its effort to restore order. And it was called a turning point in Hong Kong history or a watershed in history. But it was also generally agreed that it was understudied. 1989, it was the student movement in Beijing that was widely covered in television news in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, 3 mass rallies were organized to show support. It was also considered a turning point in Hong Kong history because it ushered in an era of unprecedented democratization of Hong Kong's political structure under Chris Patten, as Lee said in 2019. And starting from June 4th in 1990, a candlelight vigil was held in Victoria Park as commemoration, which lasted for 30 years until 2019 and was often taken as an indicator of one country, two systems and freedom of expression. But we can also see a major difference in terms of their remembrance, despite their similar historical significance. Memory about 1967 often generates controversies, while the 1989 memory is marked with moral clarity. A survey also confirmed that 1989 was the second most recorded historical incident in Hong Kong, while 1967 was recorded by a small percentage of respondents. In fact, the first systematic review of the 1967 protest came only shortly before 1997, when a young journalist, Gary Zhang, pursued the subject matter at that time. If we did a Wise News keyword search, we will also notice that the commemorative news reports were absent until the 40th anniversary. There were more coverage and discussion in the 50th anniversary. And other than these, of course, 1967 was also mentioned in news or television dramas. But in short, the memory treatments appear rather different for the two protests. My colleagues, Professor Francis Lee and Professor Joseph Chan, have asked why Hong Kong has not forgotten 1989. Their on-site surveys suggest that media did play a major role in memory transmission. Young people came to a gradual discovery about the events. Although they could get some facts wrong, they demonstrated strong emotional imprint and moral clarity regarding the nature of the incident. So the question is why not 1967? Why isn't it remembered in similar scale? It happened in Hong Kong and it lasted for a longer period of time. And it led to many arrests and also death with intense confrontations. It becomes a major focus of the present study. As said, I have looked at the roles of media technologies, which I'm not going to report in detail here. And I'm sure that there are other factors that can account for the differences and similarities. But I want to focus on media content. In terms of media content, I tried to analyze the ideological packages embedded in anniversary news editions from 1990 to 2019. In this study, I did find some recurring themes, including the tendency to remember the remembrance because memory is constantly perceived at risk. But more specifically, I wanted to probe into the roles of journalists as agents of memory. I emphasize on young journalists because I want to find out how they have been socialized into particular memory traditions in the first place. And I'm also curious about the journalistic process they went through, including how they research about the topics, how they came to the use of certain news angles, and their major concerns in the process. So in this study, I interviewed 20 journalists. 12 were born after 1990, 5 were born between 1984 and 1989, 3 were born in the late 1960s and early 1970s. So altogether, we've got 17 young journalists here in this study who worked for newspapers, digital media, and television news. Each interview lasted for up to 2 hours, and they were conducted between September 2018 and March 2019. Regarding mnemonic socialization, most informants in this study couldn't recall how they first came to know about both historical events. They just know anyway. Comparatively speaking, they know more about 1989 and barely about 1967. An informant confided that she first thought 67 was June 7th, as in the case of June 4th. When her senior realized that she didn't know about 1967, the senior was very surprised. But to be fair, other journalists in this study didn't fare better in their understanding about 1967 before they worked on their assignments. They could at best mention keywords like fake bombs, leftist, and Namban, and lack any substantial knowledge about what actually happened. In view of the roles of memory institutions, school appeared to be the most influential. Most informants could recall how passionate teachers taught about 1989, and some were influenced to the extent that they decided to help to transmit the memory ever after. Family, on the other hand, rarely mentioned about the past. Our informants note that it was typical to be apolitical in Hong Kong family culture. And finally, media. And many agreed that media did play a certain role because they provide fragments of memory. So time and again, they could pick up some words or keywords or bits and pieces about these events. But on the whole, they were about general mood or sentiments, but not concrete details, particularly in the case of 1967. So the question is, when it came to their turn to produce news stories about these events, how did they respond and how did they act? All agreed that it is very different from other news assignments. In other news assignments, and in particular daily news, they do not feel the pressure to be knowledgeable about the cases or the issues at stake. Regarding the historical events, however, they became very anxious because they didn't know enough. Worse still, they had to observe tight deadlines and they still had to produce content when the deadlines were here. In this case, the production time ranged from 5 weeks to 4 months. So how did they begin? To begin, they all started with general research. The first thing everyone did was to ask Google. And as you can imagine, they would use keywords and fragments of memory they came across throughout the years to start the search, without any specific techniques. And some would use Wise News to check out old coverage. The purpose was to find out what had been covered before so that they could try to avoid repeating similar angles. But an informant, after she did an extensive review of Wise News, she was surprised to see that similar news material about the two protests were repeated again and again over the years. And some informants would read both, especially those written by their interviewees. They also read books to identify names for further interviews. and because it was very important for them to find people to speak about the past. For those who found it too demanding and not having enough time to read both, they would just go to ask experts. And in this case, for example, when reporters were working on 1967, many of them would go to ask for advice from Gary Jern. In the rarest occasion in this study, it was when the production time was up to 4 months. Our young journalist in this study did all these. He first asked Google, then he read books, and he also attended forums organized by relevant organizations. And he read all newspapers in library because he wanted to have a feeling of the atmosphere back then. And he also visited government archive. Only after he finished all these, he felt more confident about the subject matter. But most others didn't have this luxury of time. Most stressed how stressful they felt when they faced very knowledgeable old participants. Every time he talked about something that I don't know, I felt like I was being questioned, but I really know so little, it is hard. It was from an informant working on 1967. Another informant also working on 1967 anniversary edition said, because they were so keen to push the stories on me and I had no knowledge to judge whether these stories were true or not, it made me very uneasy. The stress also came from the need to find new news angles. To cope with the stress and this pressure to be new, they tried to find live witnesses of the events. But as we can imagine, as time goes by, it will only become more difficult to find witnesses. Yet, to journalists, in this case, they really wanted to find real people to speak about the past, because in this case, they could focus on the personal and the emotional aspects through retelling of personal stories. By doing so, they can avoid getting into controversies, and they do not need to venture into unverifiable disputes, because as their general research would inform them that 1967 was often about controversies. This is a quote which is particularly illuminating. To be honest, after I had done some research and gained an initial understanding, I realized that given the production time and my connections, I would not be able to talk about finding the truth. I simply didn't have the time, so I decided to take a step back. I asked who remembers 1967. The whole point is to ask why some people cannot forget 1967. I used this angle because it was less risky for me. I didn't need to discuss if something was true or false. I didn't have the time and methods to prove anything. I had read all newspapers, for example, but we know that different newspapers have different political stances. When I read about a controversial incident, there were conflicting reports even back then. Now, after all these years have passed, I had to consider different viewpoints. People choose to believe in different things. I would rather take a more conservative approach and let people say what they believe. So this is an exemplary quote and reflected a lot of the common feelings of our informants. Newsroom culture, on the other hand, also sets the tone of these news reports. Our informants have observed that many of their seniors were young and just entered the journalistic profession in 1989. They were committed to remember it and insisted on covering it during anniversaries. It showed that there were indeed intellectual and cultural traditions that informed journalistic practices. Another aspect of newsroom culture, however, concerns about censorship and self-censorship. Our more senior informants found that anniversary journalism could be used as a strategy against censoring practices because it will be too obvious if they are ignored. However, they also observed that the news organizations responded by sending young journalists to cover the news, probably for reasons we have discussed above. So what are the lessons learned? And what about cultural authority of journalism and media? This case of young journalists and old news suggests that collective memory is found to be partial and incomplete. So their authority lies with their abilities to provide discounted version. And memory construction is characterized by a tendency to discount the memory through which the personal, the emotional, and uncontroversial narratives dominated and prevailed. Or to put differently, they produce distilled versions of the past, in which only the essential and the dominant narratives are kept without substantial and concrete details. So the collective memory is characterized by a moral clarity, as in the case of 1989, and it remains to be ambiguous and uncertain, as in the case for 1967. All interviews were done before March 2019, and things have changed rather drastically after that. What will be collective memory from now on? Of course, we don't have the answer. But without the ongoing changes, even without these changes, digital media have presented considerable challenges to our understanding of collective memory. So in this final part, I would like to talk a few things about digital memory. Memory is changing a lot because remembering is now almost by default with all the digital devices. Think about how memory is captured in our mobile devices. And so everybody can capture different images when they are in the scenes of protest, for example. And memory can be stored with unlimited capacity. And people are having more choices or freedom to represent their own versions of memory in social media platforms. Not to say that memory will be retrieved rather easily, and also because of the presence of search engines and algorithms, memory can be retrieved in rather different manners for different people. In short, memory silos and memory contestation are bound to be more obvious and frequent. These bring new questions to us. What is history? This is a big question. But when it comes to collective memory, we are asking whose history, what history, and why they are mediated or presented now. So there also are questions related to personal memory and collective memory in the digital age. And what are the implications of cognitive memory to collective identities or sense of community? And how about memory activism? How will it be transformed or practiced in digital media? These questions suggest more exciting projects for mediated memories. And to round up my presentation today, I would like to reiterate 2 points. Implications of this particular paper and the overall project. First, I think, or I hope I have contributed to some clarification of the notion of mediated memories with the consideration of the roles of how memory is embodied through media, how media uphold or reinforce certain memory accounts, and how media generation differs in remembering and forgetting, and hence affecting the transmission of collective memory. Secondly, this paper has raised questions about how professional norms and practices in journalism facilitated and constrained commemorative journalism and hence discounting or distilling collective memory. I think these are quite important for the curriculum or the teaching and learning of journalism education. And I hope that this paper will bring in some new perspectives about how we can train young journalists or develop a better sense of handling of these more serious topics like history and collective memory. Thank you very much for your time and hope you all enjoy today's conference and see you in Hong Kong. Thank you.
So I guess, again, just like the previous presentation, feel free to send your questions and comments to Donna about the paper itself or about her bigger project on mediated memories, because she's absent, so we would also obviously skip the award presentation. Right. Okay. Yes. Actually, you can give me. Okay. I'll bring it to her. But anyway, so on this note, we will end the second paper presentation and we'll pass it to I think Ray is the third, right? Yes.
Hi, good morning. This is Ray Yap of CityU. It's my duty to introduce Samson's prize-winning paper to the audience. First of all, I think it's highly surprising if you look at the publications on Hong Kong over the last 5 years, probably. Almost 70% of them are about protests. But luckily, the research community have tried their very best not to keep repeating the same argument. And over the year, we see this gradual expansion, the depth and width of the research topic, which is good. And today's Samson paper is a good example of this because for a very long time, we have been keep talking about mobilization, of course, right? But you see the growing trend that more and more people start talking about the counter mobilization, how they respond by using various means to counteract this public political participations. But at the same time, this paper is a long overdue effort in a sense that we have been keep talking about all these, for example, the 50 cents more. Right, and 5 cents more, and this use of FUX and in this counter mobilizations. But we have been also talking about this. In fact, the Samson's paper's topic is a native place organization, Tong Hang Wei. But for a very long time, we only have very much anecdotal evidence, right? But this paper, I think, is one of the best effort and trying to look into the organizations, the origins, the structures of these kind of organizations. And I think this paper is impressed us in various sense. Firstly, the methodology, the data itself is very difficult to assess, and you have to win the trust of those people, which is obviously may not be on the same wavelength with Samson on many issues. And how to build the data is a very important task, and somehow this paper managed to do that. And it also look into the structures and of these organization structures of these type of organizations. And very interestingly, about its linkage with this mainland authority. And lastly, the role of elites and leaders in the operations and organizations of this body. So I think without further ado, I will pass the floor to Samson to tell us more about the paper. Samson, please.
So thank you very much. Thanks, Ray, for the flattering introduction, and thanks AHKS for giving me this award. I'm very honored to have received this recognition. So this paper was published in Modern China in 2019. I started collecting the data on my. Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. So so this paper was published in Modern China in 2019. I started the data collection in 2018. In fact, the paper was born with my son because I literally wrote part of this paper in the maternity ward. And I thank my wife for not beating me up until today. So I'm very, very thankful for this award. So this paper is about the cultural politics of native place associations in Hong Kong. And if you look around, there is actually quite a lot of work on native place associations in the past, and talking about their historical role in places that have a large Chinese population. But there isn't a lot of work about their contemporary importance, because the assumption is that as we modernize, our native ties, our traditional ties will fade away. So, but in fact, in Hong Kong, what we see is the opposite. In the recent 2 decades, we see a resurgence of native place association. And so this gives us a very good chance to look at this. And the research is based on a novel organizational data set that I built. I didn't actually manage to talk to a lot of native place association members because it's difficult to reach those population. But there's actually a lot of primary sources that we could rely on, and I'll introduce that in the presentation. Okay. So the research puzzle that I posed was that despite the historical importance of native place association around the world, there's impression that they are relics of the past because as we modernize, as we live in the city, as migrants leave their native places, their ties will fade away. So of course, in Hong Kong, we see the revival of native place association in the past 2 decades after the sovereignty handover in 1997. Not only are these associations growing in the numbers, but they're also growing in terms of their variety and also the sophistication in how they organize. At the same time, we also see native place associations playing a much more active role in society, in politics, in elections, in protests as well. So the underlying question that I asked is what was driving the resurgence of native place association, and more importantly, in what ways is this resurgence taking place? So what we know about native associations so far, that as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, there is a large body of literature on native place associations. They've been thoroughly researched by Chinese historians. We know that native place association were first actually established in China back in the Ming Dynasty. The first recorded native place association was actually Bucking Mowu Huiguan. Was founded by migrants from Mowu, a city in Anhui in Beijing during the Yongle period, Wenlock Lin Gan. And of course, they subsequently proliferated around the world. There's a lot of work that covers different roles of native place association, including the socio-cultural role, how these associations provide food, lodging, schooling, recreation, religion, and burial services to Chinese migrants in places that they are residing in. How associations are providing the economic role in terms of trade, in terms of talents, investment, remittance, and transnational business networks. And there's a smaller proportion of work that focus on their political role. looking at how they're providing some kind of quasi-governmental functions, especially when the state is not providing that services, and also how the Native Place Association are influencing hometown politics, especially during the earlier 20th century, before the 1911 revolution. We can see that Native Place Association played a very important role in supporting the revolution back in China. So what is less known is how the Native Place Association are involving in local politics, and how are they organized as a network. That hasn't been really systematically looked at. So I think the Hong Kong case provide a very good instructive case actually, for us to look at how they take root, how they research, how they reorganize themselves. So in Hong Kong, Native Place Association have a long presence. It started in the early colonial period, as soon as the British colonized Hong Kong. So by 1990, Elizabeth Sin actually counted that there are more than 220 Native Place Associations, but most of them are for natives from the Guangdong and the Fujian province, because most of the migrants from Hong Kong are from these two provinces. They were briefly active. They were quite active in social and cultural in aspects, but not very much in politics. Except during the 1980s, they were briefly active because of the Hanover negotiations. So some of especially the Fujian associations, they try to organize a society in support for Hanover. But after the negotiation, they declined again because the political elites, they were shifting their focus to the newly rising political party scene or other kinds of community organizations. So they shift their attention away from Native Place Association. So after the Hanover, we saw a revival of the Native Place Associations, and of course their increasing incorporation in the state building effort in Hong Kong, and namely the United Front. So one question the first question that I try to ask in this project is, how do we conceptualize Native Place Association? Are they purely civil society organization, or are they state affiliated, state influence associations? Because you can argue it in both ways. They can be voluntary association because people can choose whether to join, because they belong to certain native places, they have the freedom to join it. But on the other hand, because they're incorporated under state building, you can also argue they're state influence, so they're more like the gongos in China. They're so with a lot of state influence. So I try to conceptualize it in between. I think they are in between. They can't be seen as just state agents, and on the other hand, they are also influenced by the state. So I tend not to quickly reach a conclusion on how to categorize them. But instead, I use the concept. I borrowed this concept from Prasenjit Duara's work on culture, power, and state, what he calls the cultural nexus of power. So he conceptualized this term to understand how the Qing state was governing China, even though they were not very penetrated in local society. So they rely on associations like lineage groups, irrigation associations, religious organizations, and temples to govern local society. So he calls this network of organizations, informal organizations, the cultural nexus of power. And these organizations are powerful, not because they represent state interests, but because they possess the symbols and norms that can help the state in gaining legitimacy. Okay, so he defines the nexus as hierarchical organizations of networks of informal relations that constantly intersect and interact with one another. And the culture term in cultural nexus refers to the symbols and norms embedded in organizations that are meaningful to their members. Okay, so I find that native place associations in Hong Kong, especially after 1997, resemble this cultural nexus of power. First, because they are very interconnected with one another, as I'll show you through the data. How the director lists are actually, there's a lot of overlapping. And secondly, the native place networks embodies a lot of symbols and norms like kinship bonds, dialect, habits, myths, historical experiences, and religious practices. Right? And these are not overtly political, but nevertheless, they will create some sort of culturally oriented national identity that strengthens at least the loyalty of some part of the population. So methods and data, and this is a very actually quite difficult topic to research because it's hard to gain first-hand knowledge. It's hard to do ethnographic research. Even though, because of this project, I did join the Yun Clan Association dinner for once for ethnographic research at London Dai Jiao Lao. I still remember I had to stood up to listen to, well, to the picture of Yun Song Woon on the screen and sing the national anthem to Yun Song Woon. Not Yun Sai Hoi. And very, very great experience, but I didn't rely on those experience for this paper. I built an original data set of native place association, composing both organizations and personnel. So first I did a bottom-up keyword search because I was interested in, how many native place associations are actually in Hong Kong now and when were they established. So I did a bottom-up search through various sources like newspapers, Wise News, Google, and actually advertisements from Wenhui Bao, Dao Bao actually are very useful because native place associations often place advertisements on state affiliated newspapers. And I also check up the registration list under Hong Kong Society Ordinance. So I use a variety of keywords that could be associated with them. Second, I also compile the directorate list because I would like to see how they are networked together through annual reports, newsletters, and advertisements. Because usually on those advertisements, you'll see a list of director lists. But in some very obscure or lower level associations, you might not be able to find that. So Hong Kong U Library Special Collection, Special Hong Kong Collection actually has a lot of the most complete database of those annual reports. So and what I did is to check out to read them. And then you'll see that at the back, usually there are directorate lists. And I didn't actually type them all. So what I did is I rely on the Google OCR. You can take a picture and actually it allows you to electronically transform those pictures into words. So this actually saved me a lot of time. And very, very, very useful technology for research. And this is what I found. So this is the descriptive finding of my research and showing the trend of growth in the establishment of native place association. So there are three trends that you'll probably notice in this picture. First is that there's a lot of native place association established after the handover. So I mentioned before the handover, during the 156 years of colonial rule, there were 230, 220 native place associations. So after 1997, there were 200 new native place associations in just shortly 20 years' time. Second is that you notice after 1997, the growth actually stalled. There are not a lot of new associations until 2008. There's a sudden jump. I hypothesize it could be related to the Olympics because they have native place association is a very good vehicle to project the image, overseas Chinese, a rising China. And you see that the growth actually sustained until 2015. So a lot of new associations were established during this period. And the third trend is that you'll see a lot of provincial level, top level native place association were established to incorporate lower level, city level, prefecture level, county, township level into the umbrella organizations. So it's very interesting because historically, for example, in the Fujian community, there is some kind of tension, clashes between different dialect groups, the Minnan and the Minnan and the Minzhong groups, because they speak different dialects. Okay, and the Minnan group are located at they have their base in North Point, and the Minzhong group actually have their base in Junwan. So when the Fujian Association, the top level provincial association was established, they actually incorporate these two organizations under their umbrella and create some sort of unity among them. And the same with the same is true for the Guangdong community. So the Guangdong Association was established, and if you look at how they're organized, they're actually very interesting. They make the leaders from all the 21 prefectural levels association. So on top there's Guangdong, and on the second level there is Dongguan, Guangzhou, and all other prefectural level native place association. They make those leaders as the deputy chairman. Okay, and the chairmanship will rotate among leaders from 3 dialect groups, because in Guangdong people speak the major dialects: Cantonese, Hakka, and Chaozhouese. Okay, so the chairman actually, if you look at it, they rotate among these 3 people who speak these 3 dialects. And if one of them serve as the chairman, the other 2 will be executive chairpersons. Okay, so organizationally, they kind of incorporate them into a more unified whole. And the second trend is that if you look further, you'll notice that there is a lot of lower level native place association on the prefecture level, county level, and township level. And you notice that a lot of them are actually come from initiatives from the local governments in China, because they have a mandate to set up a native place association here. You'll see they actually mirror the administrative structure in the Chinese government. If you look at how they are organized, they're no longer organized just by a dialect group, but they're organized by the administrative region in China. Okay, so the next question is who and what is driving this process? Okay, so I argue that political elites play a very important brokerage role, because they are responsible for laying the groundwork. They have to create the associations from scratch. So if you look at the annual report, you'll see that local elites actually donated a lot of money to set up these associations, and they lend out their office space. They use their political networks to find their friends to be the board of directors. So they're responsible for a lot of things: recruiting members, drafting constitution, donating money, and taking care of registration, providing office space, a lot of things. And the interesting part is that in some of these associations, you don't have to be a native to become a leader. And sometimes it's because you have specific business ties to a native place. I just will raise one example, and you can look it up yourself. The Guangxi Federation, for instance, you'll notice that a lot historically most of their leaders are not from Guangxi origin, because in Hong Kong I think it's quite hard to find someone from Guangxi. There's not a lot of political elites who are from Guangxi. So you find that many of the leaders are actually from Chaozhou, because in Chaozhou, there's a lot of Chaozhouese businessmen, and they have factories in Guangxi. So they became the chairpersons of the Guangxi Association. And the Guangxi Association also allow non-native to join as members. If you're not from Guangxi, you can also file an application to become a member of the Guangxi Association yourself. If you're young and you identify with this principle. So brokerage, why were political elites interested in brokerage? Of course, it's because of the awards that comes together. It's the political awards of various kinds. Okay, there, if you belong to a native place association, it opens you up to a lot of networking opportunities, a lot of conventions. You can meet people. But most importantly, because it offers you a chance to compete in the political scene and to gain seats in formal political institutions, including the LegCo, including the MPC, the local MPC, and also the CPPCC. Okay, and so I try to understand, whether there's a correlation between the number of directorships held in native place associations. Okay, so if an individual hold a higher number of directorates at different kinds of native place associations, would he or she have a higher probability of being a national CPPCC member? And I find that that's indeed the case. Okay, that's totally correlation. I have another paper that looks at the causal relation. So here in this picture, you look, if people have 7 to 10 directorship, there is a 28% they are national and CPPCC member. Versus if you have just 1 to 3 ties, there's only a 2.8%. So your chance rises substantially if you hold more membership. Of course, there is a reverse causality because they are already very powerful people to begin with. Native Place Association like to invite them to be one of the member. Okay, so here I'm not trying to solve this problem of reverse causality. So if elites hold a lot of directorship at different Native Place Association, you will probably expect a very interconnected political network among the Native Place Associations, right? And this is indeed the case. And if you look at, for example, Suzanne Choi's work in 2006, she actually wrote a very, very good PhD thesis about Native Place Association. And she already pointed out there is a lot of interconnection. So it's not very surprising that elites will wear different hats and be connected to different associations. But what is surprising is that these ties are increasing over time. These interconnection were increasing over time. So if you look at the umbrella organization from the early 2010s to the late 2010s, there is already an increase in terms of the density of the shared ties. Weighted transitivity is another way to measure how they're closely clustered together. And you see that for umbrella organization, there is a rise. If we look at the Fujian Association, remember earlier I mentioned that there is like a clash between some of the localities in Fujian. You also notice that among the 10 Fujian associations, there is increasing shared directorship, meaning that they are cooperating a lot with one another. Okay, so and this shows that so there is a more unity among the Native Place Associations. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about what they do in Hong Kong, but I want to just end my presentation with 2 activities that I find quite interesting. So Native Place Associations, apart from their political engagement, they actually are very involved in the cultural activities in Hong Kong. For instance, this is the Chaozhou Festival, started in 2015, and this is actually in 2017. It was first time it was held in Chater Garden, and you'll see that the organizers invited shops from Chaozhou here to set up booths to make like fish balls and lo sui or, and then sell it at actually a very reasonable price. They do exhibitions, they do dances. I happen actually to stumble upon this event. Another is probably you have no idea what this is. This is Hubei Association's Lotus Root Festival, Lin Ao Ji, that they organize every year since 2013. So, so you'll wonder why lotus root. It's because Hubei is very famous for lotus root, and Wuhan lotus root is actually a local specialty, and they are harvested around this time of the year. So usually the Hubei, the Lotus Root Festival is organized right now, and they, after the festival, they will give out free lotus root to its participants. So very interesting. You see how they're using symbols like lotus root to promote their distinctiveness of their native places, and how they're also kind of creating a culturally oriented national identity. That even though you're not from Hubei region, you'll find something to identify with, something you find interesting. So lastly, conclusion is that what I try to portray in my research is that these native place association, they're forming a cultural nexus, scholarly contribution. So I try to show how the top-down directives and bottom-up brokerage incentives of the elites are creating this cultural nexus, and at the same time how they are involving more in the social and cultural and also political activities in Hong Kong, even in a very cosmopolitan city when native traditional ties are dying out. So implications, traditional groups can actually find renewed significance in modern and cosmopolitan societies. But the question is whether Hong Kong's case could be generalizable to other places with large Chinese population. So thanks very much. I look forward to any questions or queries that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but personally, I hope that there will be a sequel to this paper explaining the rise and hopefully the fall of Lo Man Dun, the most important PLL in Hong Kong politics today, right? But anyways, times for honoring the winner, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's take a 5 minutes break and come back for the rest of the presentation this morning. Thank you. Ricardo, we will take a break and come back.
Okay, sure.
So Ricardo, it's your turn now. Sorry,
Yeah.
I
Thank
didn't
you.
turn on the mic.
Can I start now?
Yes, please. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, dear friends and participants, it's my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Yip Hsien Ching, who is the awardee of the Outstanding Hong Kong History paper this year. I'm particularly happy that Dr. Yip's paper has set 2 new records of this event. First of all, this is the first outstanding paper in the area of church history in Hong Kong. And secondly, this is the first outstanding paper written in Chinese. Dr. Yip received his PhD degree from Graduate Institute of Religious Studies, National Chung Cheng University, and is currently a postdoctorate fellow at Research Center for Chinese Cultural Subjectivity, National Chung Cheng University. For decades, Dr. Yip has centered his research on the Pentecostal movement, first in Asia and the Chinese-speaking areas, and then from a global perspective. From my own view, I find Dr. Yip's works clearly demonstrate cross-border traveling and localization of ideas, beliefs, and institutions. Since the early 19th century, Protestant missionaries of diverse denominational backgrounds have arrived in the Chinese land and endeavored to spread the gospel to the Chinese. They gained local support, built chapels in important cities, established schools of all levels, and taken together, create Christian missionary enterprise in China. Soon, Chinese Christians established their own churches according to the principles of self-reliance, self-support, and self-propagation. These independent churches or local churches create and Chinese Christianity using local languages and integrating to a certain extent with local cultures. Particularly in Taiwan and Hong Kong, which enjoyed greater religious freedom in the post-war era, local churches create strong traditions that not only extend to different parts of the world, but also compete with Western missionaries. Dr. Yip's paper entitled A Pioneer and Paradigm of Chinese Independent Pentecostal Churches, the Pentecostal Mission, Hong Kong and Kowloon, highlights this global trend and demonstrate his scholarship in this area. Without further delay, may I introduce Dr. Yip to present his research funding of his papers to us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yip Hsien Ching. I'm the postdoctoral fellow of the Research Center of Chinese Cultural Subjectivity at National Chung Cheng University, Taiwan. I'm very pleased and honored to receive this prestigious award. Actually, I was surprised as I received the invitation that informs me to receive this award. I was very surprised because I didn't apply for it. Yeah. And I have to say what came to my mind as I saw the email was bingo buying on Shanghai. Actually, I also have a connection with Hong Kong because I have been to Hong Kong for teaching intensive courses at the Ecclesia Theological Seminary every year since 2015. So here I would like to share this honor with faculties and students of Ecclesia Theological Seminary, Hong Kong. Yeah. And I was very glad because it means my research has gone beyond the field of Pentecostal studies or religious studies. Yeah. And since I came from a country where English is not commonly spoken, so my English is pretty limited. So please let me present my paper in plain language. Okay. You may find out that my topic is kind of different from the one I submitted because actually they are two different churches. The latter is the ramification of the former. Okay, Pentecostal Mission Hong Kong and Golong is the oldest Pentecostal church in Chinese-speaking community all over the world. Let's take a look at the pictures. The picture at the left side is the general chapel of that church. It locates on Castle Street. And the middle one is the branch in Golong. It's branch in Golong, which locates on number 71 Waterloo Street or Waterloo Road. Yeah. And also we look at let's look at the picture at the right side. It's the interior of the premises. As we can see, the picture, the church, the decoration is kind of different from most Pentecostal church. The impression the most Pentecostal church leave on us, because as we can see, there is a pipe organ installed on the wall behind the stage. It looks very traditional, right? And then Golong Pentecostal Church. Golong Pentecostal Church has 5 chapels, which are the General Chapel on Perth Street, Fleming Chapel, Shutting Chapel, Funding Chapel, and Jordan Chapel. My paper has been done under 2 research frameworks. The first one is Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Studies. What does that mean by Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Studies? It is a perspective that is consistent with world Christianity that seeks to decentralize the position of the Western Church. Both of them focus on Pentecostal and Charismatic Christianity in the Global South, especially independent churches, because of their indigenized and non-Western characteristics. Classical Pentecostals in North America no longer exemplify Pentecostalism all over the world. Yeah. As we can see, many Pentecostal scholars or scholars of Pentecostalism in the West, they pose their exotic imagination upon those churches in the Global South. Okay. When Western scholars of Pentecostalism try to find cases of indigenous or independent Pentecostal churches among Christianity in China, the True Jesus Church, the TJC, a Chinese autonomous Pentecostal-like body, became the prominent case of that. From the point of view of from their point of view, I mean the Western scholars, the more the church are away from the Western missions, the more they are independent or they are indigenous. That's what they think about. In my opinion, it reflects a certain type of Orientalism. Okay, the second one is independent church movement in China. The Pentecostal mission in Hong Kong and Golong is an early independent church that has long been neglected. It has been viewed as an extension of foreign missions. Okay, for the research questions. Number 1, the first one, to introduce the history and developments of Pentecostal Mission Hong Kong and Golong, as well as Golong Pentecostal Church. relocate the position of the two churches under the taxonomy and typology of global Pentecostal or charismatic studies. Criticism on Latin Orientalism of Pentecostal studies in the West. Okay, let's come to the brief history of the Pentecostal mission Hong Kong and go on. Founding era. Let's talk about the missionary A.G. Gar first. A.G. Gar was a missionary sent by Apostolic Faith in Los Angeles to Hong Kong. Before he going to Hong Kong, he spent some times in India for mission for a while. Yeah. And when he was there, he thought he could speak their vernacular, Bengali. Bengali is a kind of Indian vernacular there. We have to know something that in the early days of Pentecostal movement, many people among them thought they can speak a unknown language, a missionary language, a foreign language given by the Holy Spirit to empower them for global mission. That means they don't have to spend time on learning or studying foreign languages, so that they can just receive the power of speaking foreign languages. We know many Pentecostals, when we talk about Pentecostals, we know they focus on speaking in tongues. Actually, speaking in tongues is a kind of unknown language. It's a glossolalia, not a missionary language or senolalia. But in the early days of Pentecostal movement, many people thought that is a real language, a language given by the Holy Spirit for their global mission. A.G. Gar also held this perspective. So he went to India directly without learning languages, without studying languages. Yeah. So he found out when he was in India, he found out he could not communicate with the local people in his town speaking. So when he and his wife arrived in Hong Kong for mission in 1907 and launched Pentecostal meetings in a Chinese Congregational Church, as known as Sino-American Independent Church, 美华自理会, on Later Street, initially named Apostolic Faith Mission. When he went to Hong Kong, now he know he must hire an interpreter for him. So God hired Mo Lai Zi, a deacon of this Chinese church, as an interpreter for him. So when it comes to the Sino-American Independent Church, we have to mention its founder, Charles Hager. Charles Hager was famous for baptizing Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Yeah. And this church is now located on the intersection of Later Street and Bridge Street. I personally visited there before. Yeah, okay. The church, the Chinese Congregational Church. I mean the Pentecostal mission. I have to say, not everybody feel comfortable with Pentecostal phenomenon, including shouting hallelujahs, speaking in tongues, singing loudly, or ecstasy. So many of them were accused of practicing hypnotism. No. So Hegel and some people of the church, just made an excuse to ask them to leave the church because they have to. They would like to direct it. They would like to direct the chapel for Christmas. So those Pentecostals left the church, left the chapel, and moved to the third floor of the chapel. The third floor of the chapel was an English school ran by Mok Lai Chi. Yeah, and this church, this Pentecostal church, was co-governed by Gar Mok and Song Dengmen, a very important leader from the beginning. Gar left soon and came back in 1909. We have to say it's not appropriate to consider this church as a church planted by missionaries, by A.G. Gar or any missionaries else. Yeah. It's better for us to consider this church is a congregation started their church from the Chinese Congregational Church. It's better to understand to consider as a Pentecostal congregations started their own church out of the Chinese Congregational Independent Church. Yeah, okay. Most social engagement, offering free education for Chinese children and women, being the president of the Chinese Tenant Protective Association and being an expert witness. And Mok Lai Chi also founded a newspaper, a Pentecostal newspaper called Pentecostal Truth. It was the first Chinese Pentecostal periodicals. Actually, the paper was planned by a missionary called Mackintosh, Thomas Mackintosh. He planned to publish a Chinese Pentecostal newspaper, but he didn't put it into practice. And Mok Lai Chi fulfilled it. This newspaper contains 4 pages, with 3 pages in Chinese and 1 page in English. So let's come to the brief history of the Pentecostal Mission Hong Kong and Golong. It's a excerpt cited from his son Mo Kai Guang. As we can see, Mok Lai Chi, his father, were fighting for the tenants. Yeah, I think it's very precious for us, for us in nowadays. We may feel very happy. We may feel very glad to see that. Yeah. The church was renamed the Hong Kong Pentecostal Mission in 1910. Mok said, "Our church has used the name Apostolic Faith Mission, but we found out that the name Hong Kong Pentecostal Mission could be better. From now on, we will rename our church Hong Kong Pentecostal Mission." And he said, Hong Kong Pentecostal Mission is a Christian mission founded by Chinese rather than a branch of foreign mission set up in this country. Yeah. And in 1914, Mok reaffirmed his position that this church is a Chinese independent church. As we can see, Mok Lai Chi here, he said he is from Sanwon. I believe that some of you may know that Hong Kong used to belong to Sanwon. So I believe that it's a rhetoric for Mok to emphasize that he is Chinese and this church was run by Chinese. Post-war era and Japanese occupation era. Mok passed away on December 3rd, 1926. Song Dingman stood out as a successor. In 1938, he retired from the occupation of civil servant and dedicated himself to full-time church ministry. He said according to the church, they planted 2 branches in Gyeongsang, currently Zhongshan, which are Yunfeng Church and Pinglan Church. According to Song Dingman's official narrative, the church planted a branch in Golong, which located on Wusong Street at the beginning, then moved to Pilgrim Street. In 1938, the church built its own chapel in 71 Waterloo Road and completed 2 years later. Golong Chapel became a catalyst to the future split. So that's why we can see the Pentecostal Mission Hong Kong and Golong, as well as Golong Pentecostal Church. I have to say it's a official narrative from according to Song Dingman and Pentecostal Mission. But according to one of my friend, a friend of mine, Hong Kong Pentecostal historian Dai Gun Ho, actually the Golong Chapel had its root in a church, in a Pentecostal church called Bethel Pentecostal Assembly, which was established by a missionary called David Barth. When David Barth went back to America, the church member sought to affiliate with the Pentecostal Mission Hong Kong. So the chapel in the picture is Yunfeng Church today. Now Yunfeng Church in nowadays became a member of the Three Self patriotic movements, development and split. The 50th anniversary service was held at Hong Kong Pentecostal Mission in 1957. Gar's second wife, Hannah Erickson Gar, Harold Herman, and Harvey McAllister were invited. Some local churches, including the Chinese Congregational Church, also congratulated them in various ways. Song Dingman passed away in 1958, and the division happened at the same year, which resulted in today's Pentecostal Mission Hong Kong and Golong Pentecostal Church. So here are the descriptions between the two parties. According to the Pentecostal Mission, Chu Chunxin of the Golong Chapel and others forcibly occupied the church and advocated independence from Hong Kong Church, renamed Golong Pentecostal Church. But according to Golong Pentecostal Church, Song Shan Hong, who is the son of Song Dingman, literally announced that he would inherit the leadership of his father which resulted in voice of dissent. Among members of the Golong Chapel, many of them rejected Song's authority. So they are fighting for property rights. The Golong Chapel lost the lawsuits in 1965. The anti-Song faction left. In 1973, Pentecostal Middle School was established on Perth Street, and a new church was established, and then several churches were successively expanded. Yeah, that's a newspaper that reported the news about the law case. Yeah, the lawsuit. Yeah. Let's take a look at the map. It's the location of the Golong Chapel of the Pentecostal Mission of Hong Kong and Golong. It's a branch of that. Those who in 1965, those who oppose Song Dingmen left the chapel, cast out. They were cast out by the those who support advocate Song. They left away and set another church just by that original chapel. And later they moved to Perth Tree and established another church. Daniel Bays, a very famous Chinese, a very famous historian of Chinese Christianity, divided independent church movement in China into two major categories. The first one is independence within mission-related struck with which Daniel Bays calls Sino-foreign Protestant establishment, and extra-mission indigenous sectors, which includes the Chinese Christian Union and the China Christian Independent Church, and the True Jesus Church, and Assembly Whole, the True Jesus Family. It was a unique Pentecostal communitarian church first established in rural Shandong province, and then the Spiritual Gift Church. The final category consists of several individual Chinese pastors, evangelists, writers, and teachers. Alan Anderson, the leading authority of Pentecostal studies today, divides global Pentecostalism into four categories or four types, which are classical Pentecostals, older independent and spirit churches, especially in China, India, and sub-Saharan Africa, that sometimes have diachronous, but usually not synchronous links with classical Pentecostalism. Older church charismatics, neo-Pentecostal and neo-charismatic churches. The Pentecostal mission in Hong Kong and Golong, as well as Golong Pentecostal Church, are both self-supporting churches and belong to the second largest category and the first subcategory. They have now removed the ecumenicity due to self-reliance and locality. This may inherit the model of the Sino-American Independent Church, 美华治理会. From the perspective of diachronous and synchronous networks, the Pentecostal mission in Hong Kong and Golong, as well as Golong Pentecostal Church, are more appropriate than the True Jesus Church as a case of independent or indigenous Pentecostal church in China. The True Jesus Church denied being categorized as Pentecostalism and tends to otherize Pentecostals. So they didn't also, it doesn't identify itself as Pentecostal. Furthermore, the TJC even lacks a synchronous connection with the Pentecostals. They serve, the church, the Pentecostal Mission, Hong Kong and Golong Pentecostal Church, serve as reminders to the global Pentecostals that's under the framework of the second category of Anderson's global Pentecostal typology. The Pentecostal Mission of Hong Kong and Golong and its branch Golong Pentecostal Church as an appropriate model and criteria for typology through which certain types of Oriental imagination goes upon independent churches in China and elsewhere of Global South might be avoided. Thanks for listening.
You have to unmute, Ricardo.
Oh, yes. Sorry. I think Dr. Yip's presentation ends here. And also, this is the end of the morning session, right?
We hope so, but not yet. No.
Why?
We still have 2 more presentations.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, it's going to be late. Okay, then you guys continue.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Maggie. So we are in this new era of hybrid teaching and meeting with both face-to-face and remote presentations. Okay, that's.
Hello, I'm Maggie Lee from the University of Hong Kong. I'm delighted to introduce our next awardee, Dr. Lake Lui, who's now Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology at the National Taiwan University in Taipei. Dr. Lui has a long-standing research interest looking at how social forces such as economic restructuring, migration, and various social cultural changes interact with national policies to affect gender relations, family relations in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Her publications have appeared in major journals, including Sociology, Social Forces, and Modern China. Dr. Lui is also a recipient of the prestigious Emerald Literati Outstanding Paper Award in 2017 for her journal article, Sexual Harassment of Women in China, the Role of Liberal Sex Attitudes. So to add to her list of awards is her paper today in the Journal of Contemporary Asia, entitled Multiple Careers Towards a Post-Work Way of Life, where she has turned to the novel phenomenon of slash work. A phenomenon perhaps is here to stay, looking at the perspectives and experiences of young freelancers in Hong Kong. So who are these slash workers? How do they blur the boundaries of paid work, volunteer work, and their own personal interests? Is slash work merely another form of labor exploitation, or does it raise new and important sociological questions about labor, freedom from labor, the life project in Hong Kong society today? So without further ado, please join us, Dr. Lui.
Well, thank you. Should I share my screen now, or can I share my screen now? Oh, I'm so bad at that though. Let's see, Oh, there's nothing for me to share. Looks like my PPT, it cannot be shared. Why is that? You guys hear me though?
Yes, we can hear you.
And you can see me as well?
Yes, we can see you.
I'm so sorry, but for some reason I cannot share the PPT, although it's open. I don't know why is that. Oh, because I opened too many. Okay, I see. All right, here. There you go. Can you see the PPT now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much Professor Lee, for your introduction. And also, I'd like to show my gratitude to the Academy of Hong Kong Studies for giving me this opportunity to present the paper. This paper was written in 2017. I started to write this paper in 2017 when I was working at Education University of Hong Kong. It seems that there is some linkage with EDU. Now I'm working in Taiwan, and I don't see all of you here in the screen, but I presume that my colleagues are still sitting there listening. Okay, anyway, so the paper is called Multiple Careers Towards a Post-Work Way of Life. Originally, the title should be /careers, but then because it is too new, the phenomenon, that Professor Kevin Hewson argued that, well, nobody probably understand what it is, and it's really hard to search for your paper if it is titled as /. So I changed it to Multiple Careers. So what are these? Who are these people, and what do they do, right? So these are some examples of who they are in order to situate or to understand, the basic concept of /. An example is this, for instance, Jason. He used to be a high school teacher. He pursued his, actually, before he became a high school teacher, he graduated in Hong Kong. He had a bachelor degree in psychology. Then he studied at University of Texas in the United States. He did his master's. And when he came back to Hong Kong, he started his career as a high school teacher. So that was his background. But after 2 years being a high school teacher, he found that it's really boring, and that he also, he feels like he has really long working hours. And that's why he changed his career. Alongside with his study, when he was in the United States, he did some music production. Initially, it was for fun. But then his friends placed his music and helped him to get into a competition where he won an award. And from that day onwards, he continued playing the music and also producing music. This is why when he faced long working hours, tedious work as a high school teacher, he started to think about what he should do next. And then he started doing music. But then he found that being a music producer really cannot earn too much money. So he capitalized on the part-time, the very precarious kind of type of work in the academia, and start to work as a part-time lecturer. So this is the background story. So who are /? You can see from this story that they have multiple careers, right? Like Jason. He is a part-time lecturer in psychology. He's a music producer. And then he also developed from being a music producer to a songwriter or the lyricist. But initially, he has a part-time job. We can see that from these examples, as we will go through them in more details afterwards, we will find that most of them had full-time job before, and yet more or less they suffered they experienced a precarious condition in the workplace, either because of the long working hours or that because they are in contracts and that maybe there are some layoff or maybe there are streamlining in the organizations. Okay, and then they change the field. Okay, so they experience precarity and that they start to develop multiple careers. At the same time, you can also see that from this list, they also build on the precarity, capitalize on the precarity, the part-time or the freelance temporary work kind of employment mode, and to develop their careers, like this 0.6 school teachers, right? A part-time public relations manager, or these kind of corporate trainer, these kind of project-based kind of work. So emergence of slash career and who they are. I give a definition here. Slash work is popularly associated with people working several jobs. Slash work is characterized by its multifaceted nature, which involves different professions that might or might not be related. Slash workers are usually well educated. Notably, slash workers share features with freelancing and portfolio work. Portfolio work is similar to work that is based on projects, like having several projects or a project after a project. Such work usually has no boundaries among occupations, firms, and levels. The story sets against the background of global competition and the casualization in the global economy. Since late 1990s, industry in Hong Kong have faced global competition. Fast technological advancement has accompanied the neoliberal logic of downsizing, restructuring, and subcontracting that has transformed the demand side of the labor market. Developed economies, including Hong Kong, have ever increasing demand for multiple skilled labor, and firms respond to these global changes by changing the management and business models. At the same time, there is an expansion of education. It increased the supply of workers and results in the surplus of qualified laborers. So as a result, it seems that the economic risk could be passed on to the employees through greater flexibility in employment terms. And that is why there's a phenomenon of precarious employment. As it is called, is uncertain, unpredictable, and risky from the point of view of the workers. Tenure employment, even for the educated, is being replaced by short-term gigs. And then precarious workers could be freelancers, portfolio workers, or part-timers who have to accept lower wages and contracts that have little promise of financial security, job stability, or career development. The purpose of this study is that I try to problematize the link between precarious employment and young people's work experience by emphasizing the agency in making their own choice about their work and life. Numerous studies have focused on precarious employment and the negative side of it. But I would really like to see whether it is completely a negative or a very sad picture, a depressing picture. It seems that past studies have also illustrated that there are some of the employees or some of the workers have an optimistic acceptance of change. Brandley and Davidson created the concept or constructed the concept of internalized flexibility for this group of people. In face of precarious work, they try to adjust themselves and be more flexible and start to embrace this kind of flexibility. Some might even welcome an indefinite period of instability when the locus of work has shifted from working for the organization to a self-enterprising experience. The second purpose of this study is to describe the new construction of work and the meaning of work. Here, I'm not saying that I'm not claiming any prevalence of slash work in Hong Kong. But then what I want to show is that it seems that there is an alternative to the traditional understanding of work. So today, I'm pretty much describing the new construction and what is the meaning behind this construction. So what does work mean in Hong Kong's context? To our understanding, in most industrial societies, work is equivalent to paid work. It's distinct from voluntary work, housework or childcare work, agricultural work for subsistence, or civic work. There's a clear boundary between work versus family, also clear boundaries between work versus leisure and community. Working for wages is a core activity in every capitalist society because it allows people to have access to material goods, and it's also central to people's identity and the social status. So this is what we usually mean by work in Hong Kong and in most industrial societies. And in Chinese societies specifically, a profession is one's face. So 面子, not only for oneself, but also for one's family. In the 80s and the 90s, the people of Hong Kong people strive to work through its elitist education system to become winners or insiders in hope of being granted standard employment positions, like full-time permanent jobs that are provided with labor protection and promotion opportunities in exchange for their productivity and loyalty. However, given, as I said, the background of casualization of work, it seems to be not as possible in today's world. And so when economics in advanced capitalist countries is influenced by the neoliberal ideology and policies that destabilize the relations of production, most workers lament their precarious employment condition and push for labor reforms. So against the background of the casualization of work, a lot of people, including activists, they strive for or push for more labor reforms, more protection for the laborers, collective bargaining power, etc. But then, interestingly, Kathy Weeks noted that actually an increasing number of people respond to the precarious of work with a call not to restore stable and reliable fordist wage relation, but rather for the ability to secure an entirely different relation between life and work. There are increasing literature on the refusal of work, but it does not mean the rejection of activities or production. The notion is very different from, for instance, 躺平, that is more commonly discussed in Hong Kong, China these days. So the refusal of work does not mean that there is no production, there is no activities, or that you don't want to do anything. Okay, it is a refusal of the ideology of work as the highest calling and moral duty. People's social life and access to rights and citizenships are no longer defined by work. So what is it then? If it is, so it refuses the capitalistic notion of work. It's not primarily focused on laborism or productivism of of work. So what is it? It demands more time, freedom, and pleasure. It's a vision of life that is no longer organized around work. It refuses voluntary servitude and construct a life that renders a positive projection of self. This is the autonomous Marxist approach that people liberate themselves from labor. And when people liberate themselves from labor, the free thinking inventiveness could arise. So the reinvention of the mode of work life should be analyzed based on subjectivity, the dissolution of spatial and temporal boundaries, and the blurring of work-life boundaries. Specifically, when we say work-life boundaries, Kathy Weeks pursue a project called Getting a Life. That is the agency's negotiation on of non-productive work. So a society of chosen time or of multi-activity that allowed everybody more freedom for self-development is not just about paid work, for instance. So what is my research question? My research question is, how do slash workers challenge the capitalistic notion of work in Hong Kong, where the institutional basis of capitalism is productivist and the cultural tradition rooted in the narrative of Asian work values? So this is my sample. I only have 28 respondents. I interviewed some of them in two different periods of time, because I want to see whether they have changed their profession, and if they change their profession, why, and this can better reflect the career trajectory of this group of people. They all have some college education, and the professions are very diverse. I found that there are two different types of slash. One is more, risk averse. There's a buffer, at least, that they have one contract or several contracts plus other projects. So the other one is all flexible projects of different nature. So there are two different types. And all of them have experienced some sort of precarity. Either they are laid off because of the because of the downsizing, or that because the firm closed down. But most of them experienced long working hours and they couldn't bear it anymore. Okay, and all these industry, my respondents span across these industries. So what I found in this group of people is that there are three major characteristics. One is the emphasis on multi-potentiality, and that the emphasis of it blur paid work, volunteer work, and personal interests. An example is Aska. She is a graduate from social sciences, and she used to be a full-time journalist in feature story section. Despite her interest in writing about diverse topics, she found that the working hours is really too unbearable and too irregular, and she really wanted to quit. So after around 5 years, 5 years in the media field, she changed her career. Although she continued to write by freelancing in the media, she also freelanced in corporate training. She also leads cultural tours. She joined the board of an NGO organization in which she promoted culture and she also organized art camps. Through trial and error, she developed careers in cultural development and counseling and therapeutic activities. So in addition to her work as a freelance journalist for 2 years, she ran Studio X for sharing art and culture, offered public workshops, and hosted a radio show about emotions and drama therapy. During the mass protests in Hong Kong in 2019, she organized some political activities and started Studio Y, offering free therapy for traumatized protesters. And this is how she defined herself. I define myself as a person with multi-potentialities. The many jobs that I am involved in aren't occupations. I'm involved in so many jobs and projects, not for a living, but for interest. I'm curious about so many things in this world and how the world connects with people. Slash work is a life choice, and I just act on my choice using different identities. So you can see that she tries to exhaust her potentials, and she has so many potentials. So she called herself a person with multi-potentiality. And as you hear how she described herself, you feel like, is it a paid job or is it a voluntary work? Is it for interest? Is it a hobby? So you see that there is a blurring between these categories. Second, I find that many of the jobs, the slash work, organize around self. So, and that results in creativity. An example is Enoch. His undergraduate degree is, he's trained as an occupational therapist, but then he worked only for 1 year as an occupational therapist. And then he changed his career as a manager in a marketing company. But then the company announced massive layoffs. He started to explore alternatives. His next job is in a small design firm that allowed him to indulge his interest in branding. What that design company failed after a year. When the design company failed after a year, he found a strategic planning position in the government, but continued to take design projects. So actually, before he developed further, he is also already slashing. Despite the benefit of regular working hours and a regular salary in the government, Enoch thought that he was spending too much of his time on meaningless tasks in the government. This inspired him to reevaluate his interests and career goals. Alongside the design, branding, and strategic planning work, he rediscovered his interest in music, which he had given up when he took his parents' advice to obtain a more practical degree of occupational therapy instead of attending a prestigious music school in the UK. So in 2015, he combined his skills in strategic management and marketing with his interest in music production. And he starts bands. So what are those bands? They are the bands for young people, and it creates a low-cost platform for young people considering a career in music. He coaches, counsels, and provides networking opportunities for these young people. And these young people, some of them are actually from the community college that he is teaching at. He teaches a course called Strategic Life Planning, and he's at the same time responsible for the school's branding and marketing. And so you can see that there is a transfer of skills from one profession to another, and that there's an overlapping interest and in developing this career. And he argued that during the strategic life planning course, he can also infuse different elements from the bands in it. And also his personal experience when he himself were also at the crossroads in choosing between different careers. I find that a lot of the slash workers have, create some new job titles. Some of them call themselves NGO trainers when they combine the experience of being a lecturer with the NGO experience with the previous business experience. Some of them call themselves NGO singer instead of a popular singer, when she combined her interest in singing with her voluntary experience that she finds unsatisfying. So there are lots of the combination of different categories creates new work titles, and that is, that creates that is what I mean by creating a career around the self and results in creativity. Lastly, well, traditional jobs, or career, we emphasize vertical. In traditional jobs, we emphasize vertical career mobility, meaning that maybe I started as a teaching assistant, and then I promote to a CM teacher, a GM teacher, whatever, a principal, vice principal. So it's usually about, we emphasize the vertical career mobility. But then I found that this group of slash workers, they care about horizontal career mobility. Michelle, she graduated in Bachelor of Arts, and she had a master's in English literature. She used to be a full-time administrator in an arts publishing company. Now she is an art space administrator, an author, a translator, and an exhibition organizer. She explains, government contracts for running art space are limited to 2 years, but coincidentally for me, I don't think I can learn anything more in the same place after 2 years. Staying in a job for 2 years is too long. I'm changing jobs every 2 years anyway. Why am I not changing places too? I joined a global community that allows for work exchange, in which I work on an organic farm for some months in Japan, and the farm provides me with food and accommodation, but with no salary. It was a way of experiencing life. Then after a year, I came back to Hong Kong to work. I'm planning to quit again. She emphasized life experience, experiencing life. It's a self-enterprising notion of work. And you can see that she's not only changing the type of job, but she also changing the places where she feels that she can learn more. A lot of the slash workers emphasize the so-called the enrichment of their life, the horizontal. This term horizontal career mobility is actually a phrase used by Michelle. So far, I depict a very romantic phenomenon of the slash workers, but then of course there are precarity. For instance, financial instability and their exploitation from the employers. Sometimes they feel solidarity through horizontal networking, and they try to help one another out, having some informal type of mentorship. And they are very angry when people use the term 潮汕, okay, to describe the experience. And they said 潮汕 sounds so unprofessional, but to them, slash work is professional. It's more professional than the professional work, so-called professional work. Why is that? For instance, Heidi, she graduated in journalism, and she worked full-time in a local news media. She's now a freelance feature news reporter, a writer, and a part-time teacher. She argues that she cannot do only one job because this reduces her capability. And she thinks that doing one job is less professional. So this is what she said. For example, a full-time teacher takes care of students' well-being, navigates the public exam students, and have so many other duties. How can they have time to reflect on students' writing? Many students don't have motivation to write because they cannot connect the learning experience with the world. But this is never a problem for journalists. I show my students my media reports and invite some interviewees in my feature stories to have face-to-face conversation with my students. My students are very impressed, and they have shown great improvement in writing since I came. At the same time, it creates greater impact for media stories. My writer friends have problems in making the public understand their writing. But as a journalist, I never have this problem because I know the average language level of the public. Yet there are also things that journalists fail to do. A journalist has very little space to write novels, poems, and fiction, and to elevate people's creativity and writing techniques. I treasure all these jobs because they are interlinked, and only if I work in this manner am I able to fill the blind spot of each profession. You know, based on the account of these slash workers, they almost convinced me into turning myself into a slash workers. During my interview with them, many of them actually tried to convince me to be a slash worker. And I find it so interesting, and that the life is so fascinating. Well, I argue that this study offers a close approximation of Week's discussion of post-work's life in East Asia. Although slash workers are in a precarious condition and continue to rely on organizations for contracts and projects, this study underscores the agency by examining how the pursuit of slash careers is an alternative to the capitalist notion of work that celebrates productivism and workerism. While it is not my intention to romanticize slash work, Slash workers' openness and confidence in embracing the future changes allow reflection on the circumstances of the hypermobile workers and the future of work in Asia. I think that for the future studies, it will be interesting to see how networks form among the multitudes and how an educated precariat could be progressive enough to inspire the convergence of grievances within the precariat class. Moreover, future studies can continue to explore the reproductive work in the life of slash workers, as Weeks did in her conception of post-work life. So far, what I mentioned, I did not cover the reproductive work, but it will be interesting to see how they redefine work by incorporating reproductive work into the understanding of slash work. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Liu, for your presentation and for your contribution to Hong Kong studies. Many congratulations again. The Academy will deliver your fabulous award to you, find a way to do it, deliver it to you in Taipei. So many congratulations again.
Take your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Annie Chan from Lingnan University, and it is my pleasure to introduce this the sixth paper in the series of awards that we're giving out this year. This paper is by Travis Kong. He's a professor, associate professor at the Department of Sociology at Hong Kong University, and the paper is called Towards a Transnational Queer Sociology, Historical Formation of Tongji Identities and Cultures in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Mainland China. So this paper is based on a meta-analysis of the literature on Tongji. Tongji means LGBT plus identities and cultures and movements. So this meta-analysis, I think the interesting thing about it is that it is very elegant. Well, it's not interesting to be elegant, and it's not elegant to be interesting, but I find the paper it has a certain elegance to it. Maybe it reflects on the author. And what Travis has done in this paper is that in this meta-analysis, he revisits and analyzes Tongji histories in these three Chinese societies since the 1980s in terms of Western impact and also mutual referencing that has taken place amongst these three societies. And the paper situates these histories in local as well as transnational contexts. And in doing so, it results in the provincializing of Western sexual knowledge. So I feel that the paper is not only talking about Tongji histories and is not only talking about these three societies, but also has a more ambitious theoretical and meta project that is behind all this. The paper situates the sociological study of sexualities in its historical and global context, and argues for a transnational queer sociology that references the mobilities paradigm and also transnational feminist sociology, as well as acknowledging the roles of textual as well as material forces such as discursive, cultural, and institutional forces in the production of sexuality regimes. So that very long sentence shows you how ambitious this paper is and how it's able to weave together all these very current as well as not so current ways of understanding societies and what happens in them. This unique theoretical framework that is transnational queer sociology enables some very interesting nuances in the Tongji histories of these three societies to be made visible. And before I turn the mic back to you, Travis, to present your paper, I just want to thank you for this very important contribution, because as a teacher of sexualities and gender, I noticed that in recent years, students are very interested in this topic, but they tend to get stuck in their passion for advocacy and for identity politics, sometimes at the expense of noticing or understanding the importance of the macro context and frameworks, which are very, very important. So this is a very important contribution that you're making. And I also feel that the framework that you have developed in this paper can also be extended for us to understand other areas of social life as well. So a big thank you for your contribution. And without further ado, I turn the mic to you.
First of all, thanks so much for the Academy of Hong Kong Studies for awarding my paper as one of the outstanding paper. And it is really my honor to receive this award. And also, thanks so much for Annie's really lovely introduction. And I know you're all hungry, so but I'm still trying to finish my presentation within maybe 25 minutes then. Right. Okay. And first of all, I think the dominant model of understanding non-Western, non-normative gender and sexualities has always been framed by the Western ideas, identities, cultures, and communities. So the Western theories seems always been the universal or the universe, and non-Western empirical experiences usually just some cases of validation. So I think my broader research questions what Annie just said is how we can actually provide a more plausible account of non-West. Oh, can change.
They're not connected.
It's not connected. Oh, here we go. So that means I still have to use this one, yeah. Right. Okay. So so my basic question is how to provide a more plausible account of non-Western and non-normative sexual identities. So that's why in this paper I propose a theoretical paradigm, what I call a transnational queer sociology. Basically has three major aims. The first one is to resist the domination of Western models by provincializing it. And the second one is to go beyond the usual global local analysis to produce mutually referenced, commonly shared, and translocally influenced experiences across different locales. And third one is to bridge sociology and queer theory by highlighting both discursive and social material analysis. Okay. And this paper is kind of like a theory paper because it's actually based on a meta-analysis of existing literature that talked about and also documenting the early historical formations of queer or Tongji identities and cultures in Hong Kong and Taiwan, roughly around the period of 1980s to 1990s, and also in mainland China, roughly 10 years later, around the late 1990s to early 2000s. Okay. Yeah. And the sociology of homosexuality, I think homosexuality in the past has mainly been studied by medicine, science, psychology, and psychiatrists. And around the 1950s and 60s, sociology is sort of trying to take up and to understand homosexuality, but basically or primarily under the literature of deviance. So to talk about labeling theory, social stigma, and all that. And then later on, in the 1970s to 1980s, it's sort of the really big debate of what we call the sexual essentialism versus sexual constructionism. Basically, the debate is talking about whether sexual identity is inborn or socially constructed. But in the 1990s, the arrival of queer theory, I think it offers a really strong critique to the mainstream gay and lesbian theory, especially talked about social constructionism. Three main points. The first one is queer theory trying to see sexual identity not fixed, but more influx, flexible, multiple, and fleeting. Second, the social construction of sexual minority has almost always been framed by middle-class white gay and lesbian experiences. Queer theory trying to say that this actually marginalized a lot of other voices, say like bisexual, transgendered, and people with color, and also working class, and along the line of gender, sexuality, races, and all that. And third point, I think which is quite important, mainstream gay and lesbian theories is a minority theory. But queer theory trying to criticizing it or trying to in some way challenging it by arguing that the construction of heterosexuality is only been made possible at the expense of homosexuality. So by criticizing instead homosexuality and heterosexuality binary, they're trying to open up a new and general theory of critique. Well, but anyway, like, you know, no matter we talked about society of his homosexuality or like queer theory has nothing to do with understanding non-Western homosexuality, which was first studied mainly under history, literature, or anthropology. But since 2000s, like queer studies actually have a really sort of like a global turn, and then to generate like a really dominant Western model. This kind of like Western model, first of all, is like pioneered by like Dennis Altman's notion of global gay identity. In the sense, it's talking about like gay identity seems to be immersed in different places across the world, but then like most of the time it's kind of like a copycat of like the Western model, primarily talked about the US model. Okay, and secondly, is to talk about or then to change from the identity discourse to the citizenship discourse by Diane Richardson, which talked about or theorizing sexual citizenship in terms of three different right claims: content-based, identity-based, and relationship-based. And then, but then that kind of like Western model is not just on the academia, but it's also on political movement and activism. So since the 2000s, they actually advanced the whole assimilation political movement, mainly around the whole notion of same-sex marriage. And finally, more economically, is to talk about the emergence of consumption-based urban enclaves. You can actually see like, you know, kind of like gay ghettos in most urban cities across the world. So this becomes sort of like, you know, the dominant Western model that in some way implicitly asked other non-Western accounts to follow. So speaking about like globalization of sexuality, or the relationship between globalization and sexualities, Frank Martin and other scholars actually trying to talk about three different models. The first one is like what I just told you, you know, what they called the global homogenization model. That means like the sexual Westernization on a global scale. And then the second model seems to be like a reaction to the first one. It's actually talking about some scholars, they trying to dig out so-called the roots of the local indigenous sexual experiences and trying to find so-called authentic sexual identities and cultures uninfluenced by the Western force. But then they're trying to say that, well, yeah, I mean, these two approaches are actually not that like appropriate, like, you know, or really good at like explaining the situation. So that's why they propose what they call the queer hybridization model. To quote, both Western and non-Western cultures of gender and sexuality have been and continue to be mutually transformed through their encounters with transnationally mobile forms of sexual knowledge. So in around kind of like the same times, like in 2000, so that's like the emergence of what we call now the queer Asian studies. Basically talked about two different camps. The first one is the queer diasporic study. It's really mainly talking about those scholars of Asian origin, but then they now live in Western society. And so they're trying to explain the really intricate relationship between sexuality and race in Western culture. And then the second approach, or the second camp, is what we now call the critical regionalism, is to conceptualize queer life in the complex modernities of Asia at the centers of a transnational queer critique. So I myself would be seeing myself work as part of this like queer Asian studies. And so I propose this transnational queer society based on like different theoretical paradigms. But basically what I'm trying to do is to examine the connection and flows that transverse a variety of locations and show how different locales are exposed to and adapt wider translocal, interregional, and cross-national social, cultural, economic, and political influences. So more specifically is actually trying to offer both analysis of how generalized processes impinge upon national practices and analysis, but comparing different nations at the same time. And also what I'm trying to do is to emphasize how social structures are mediated and reproduced through cultural representation and discourse, and how discourses are embedded in particular social structural configurations that make such cultural analysis possible. So in this sense, like I actually treat like discursive analysis and social and material analysis as two sides of the same coin. I'm kind of like using different like methods like to do that kind of like comparative work. For example, like like the the comparative historical analysis, the very famous one, like in the Asia method, and also I was actually talking about the inter-Asia referencing. So right. Here we go. This is like, you know, my very brief like proposal of my approach, what I call transnational queer society. In the following, I'm trying to apply it into 3 different Chinese locales. So talk about the 3 different ways of being queer or 同志. I think what is interesting, like homosexual cultures has always been present, but it also seems to be vanished, like in the post-war like era. In these 3 places. But then I'm particularly talking about the emergence of contemporary 同志 identities in Hong Kong and Taiwan in roughly like 1980s to 90s, and also in mainland China in late 1990s to early 2000, because of the fact like around that time, there's actually a blossoming of like visible, explicitly queer cultural production, commercial venues, political activism, together with a more distinctive gay, lesbian, or 同志 identity. And also, what I'm going to offer is like more like a social material analysis. So I'm going to articulate 3 major sites, what I call like the sites of governance, but also sites of resistance: the state, the market, and civil society. Okay, so in Hong Kong, like well, Hong Kong is very much like, you know, influenced by the state at that time, like by British colonization. Chinese homosexuality has never been a crime in Taiwan or in China. Okay. But in Hong Kong, homosexuality was actually a very serious crime, and the maximum penalty was life imprisonment, thanks to our like British like colonization. And so in post-war Hong Kong, I think there were 2 very interesting closeting mechanisms. The first one is the family. The family at that time really defined your social roles, arranged marriages, overt career possibilities, and also provide social security. And also another one is religion, Western religion, particularly talked about Christianity. I think because of like the earlier missionary work, and so most of the social welfare services like education, medicines, and all that, and been really provided by voluntary agency with a very strong religious background. And because of that, like what I call the first 同志 generation, they actually have lived with that kind of environment. They've seen themselves as like criminal, sick, and shameful. But what is interesting, like they actually break from the older or traditional Lutheranism in ancient Chinese literature. So most of them that I talked to, they never really knew or heard about this traditional Lutheranism, like, you know, Dun Zhao Fan Tou story. So what is interesting about like the emergence of contemporary 同志 identities in Hong Kong is around the 1980s and 1990s. There are 3 major forces: legal, economic, and generation. So the first one is John McClellan. That was John McClellan. and he was homosexual and also a police inspector. But because he committed suicide, and then it was actually a police scandal. And after that, like the colonial Hong Kong government set up a committee and reviewed the whole policy governing homosexual conduct and trying to propose homosexuality should be decriminalized in 1983. But then it talked about like many years because it stirred up a lot of heated debate around the time in the society. The second one, in parallel with that, sort of like the Hong Kong process of inference, like changing from like an industrial society to an international financial center, is the development of Pan economy. And so with the development of like a very Western expatriate dominated communities. What is interesting is about what we now call the Western Chinese interracial intimate pair, what we call Chao Fui. So this is like it's almost like a younger Chinese man look up for like social mobility, hook up with this like older, more mature and economically more secured Western expatriates who actually like, you know, want to have love and sex through money. And second one is, of course, like, you know, the whole transnational tourism because of like, you know, the more economically powerful of the population. So they would like, you know, do a lot of like tourism to many different places in Southeast Asia. And finally is the post-war baby generation, especially those who actually educated Western, but then came back to Hong Kong. They're trying to like, you know, to set up some underground gay and lesbian groups and also trying to influence the society by talking about and discussing about homosexuality in the cultural platform. So the result of it is actually a very strong middle class and Western or cosmopolitan sort of like subject, Tongzhi subject. And because of the political channel actually has been blocked. So the development of it is actually not really to a development of a political subject, but more to a subject that actually concern more about cultural and economic expression. So this is the situation about Hong Kong. And then in Taiwan, the situation is quite different. When Chiang Kai-shek actually got defeated by Mao Zedong and then moved to Taiwan and with this political regime of like Kuomintang and then to root Taiwan and also with a very long period of martial laws. And that was like, you know, the context. But interestingly, as unlike in Hong Kong, homosexuality has not been a crime in Taiwan, but it's an offense against certain kind of like law. The Chinese family is still like a major closeted mechanism. And also, unlike in Hong Kong, religion didn't, especially Christianity, didn't really been a very active voice before 2000. Okay, so the first Tongzhi generation in Taiwan is similar to the case in Hong Kong. They lived more like in a closet life, you know, feeling very shameful about themselves, and they also got married. The emergence of the contemporary Tongzhi identities in Taiwan for around the similar period, like in Hong Kong, but then actually by two very different forces. The first one is interesting because like in Taiwan actually have a very long process of political and demographic movement rooted in Marxism. Tongzhi movement is actually part of it, along with like feminism and labor movement. So there are lots of like NGO actually set up like in that period of time. And the second major force, partly because of the martial law. So that's why like there's a very strong suppression of the political identity. So that's why there's an explosion in the cultural aspect. Literary production in popular culture has been really flourishing. Crystal Boy seems to be like the iconic like figure of it. Okay. And the result of it is interesting, is actually like a more, is a more modern and political identity closely associated with academic and media literary like circles. So how about in mainland China? In mainland China, the situation is interesting. Like homosexuality has been seen as a mental illness, seems like 1920s, but then later, around in 1979, it was seen as a hooligan. And again, like in the family is like a really major closeting mechanism, the pressure of getting married and having children and all that. So the first Tongji generation is like in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Most of them, they have to live in a closet life and also got married, having children with some fleeting homosexual encounters. And the emergence of the gay contemporary Tongji identities in mainland is almost 10 years later, because of like the opening up actually started a little bit late. First of all is of course some change of law. Like in 1997, there was like a revision of the criminal law, and that revision they deleted explicitly the crime of hooliganism, and also in 2001. There was the removal of homosexuality from the list of mental illness, but they're actually really late and compared with the international practice, which actually happened in 1975. But what is interesting is two major forces. The first one is the public health paradigm. The Chinese government really make use of the whole idea about public health paradigm to understand the whole notion of homosexuality. It was actually quite late because the Chinese government didn't recognize the existence of homosexual until 2003 because of the really strong and big onset of the what we call the MSM, men having sex with men, infection of HIV and AIDS population. But then this is interesting because exactly because of that, like a lot of like transnational Tongji activists from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and overseas, they camouflage themselves as an HIV/AIDS public health organization, and then to offer a lot of like workshop researches on homosexuality because they could not actually talk about human rights, so they have to camouflage themselves with the public health NGOs. But exactly because of that is actually paved the way for homosexuality to be heard, to be researched, and also to be studied. And secondly, in parallel with this states like open to all sort of like capitalist practices is the emergence of the pink economy. So as a result of it is actually the creation of what we call the middle class 素质, the quality and urban 同志 subject. Well, like I can only give like a very, very brief history. Like so now I just come down to like a very, very brief conclusion. And so to sum up what I just said. First of all, like using this like transnational queer sociological approach, first of all is like to conceptualize or to understand the emergence of Tongji identities in some way is neither a mere replication of Western models of homosexuality, like the global gay identity, nor ratification of so-called authentic Chinese homosexuality. Well, you can actually see like the West still have a very strong impact, especially in the past, like the Western discourse about medicine, science, and deviance. But later on also talking about like the Western notion of human rights actually have been really strong, impacting on the 3 different locales. And but then this kind of like global gay identity that in some way link sexual emancipation, rights, assimilation, and inequality doesn't seem to be like getting a lot of like echo in the local context. Coming out model is a really important or very typical example because the Western idea about coming out is like, when you come out to your parents, like, you just leave your family, right? And then because like you have the capacity and also the expectation to leave the collectivity, and that is formed like, your autonomous self. But in the Chinese context, there's actually no native family to left behind, right? After you come out to your family, you still have to live with your family or still have to live with that kind of like family network. So there's actually like, a lot of like discrepancy between so-called the global gay identity model and then the local models. Okay. And secondly is like the inter-Asian referencing. Like the first one, of course, is the queer appropriation of the term 同志. The term actually started in Hong Kong in 1989 when the first Hong Kong Lesbian Gay Film Festival coined as the Hong Kong 同志 Film Festival. And so 同志, which actually means the political comrade, actually got a very new queer connotation referring to the umbrella term of LGBTQ. Okay, and also that secondly is about the Chinese 同志 conference would actually draw different individuals from Hong Kong, Taiwan, China, and also Singapore, Malaysia, to come together and to talk about like how we can actually formulate identities, activisms, and everything that relate more to the local context. The second one for me is really interesting. Sorry, it's about Marxism. As an intellectual thought or as a political force, is ironically actually materialized in Taiwan rather than in the other two Chinese locales, not in Hong Kong as a British colonization, or even not in mainland, you know, because like Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism actually combined with structural functionalism to build a new China. And thirdly, I think is that imperialism, like when we say like the West, in this paper, when I talked about the West, is like I use it as a cultural construction rather than a geographical absolute. You know, collectively is referring to the social and political construct of European and North American societies, but also including like New Zealand and Australia. But in that sort of like, you know, understanding, you can see there are many different West, you know, and not like in a homogeneous entity. So you can see like Hong Kong is more influenced by British culture, but Taiwan is more influenced by American culture. But we also have to understand sub-imperialism. So for example, like the Hong Kong gay business model actually have a really strong impact in mainland China in the early 2000s. And cultural, the Taiwan cultural production also have a very strong impact in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong and Taiwan's HIV and AIDS model and has a very, very strong impact on mainland China. But later on, like, you know, you can see like a more stronger, intense circulation of queer flows among Asia. The third one is like sociology and queer theory. What I'm trying to do in this paper, like, even though it's very, very brief, like it's trying to talk about like the combination of discursive and social material analysis. From here, I mean articulate three major sites of governance and resistance. The first one is the state. You can see like the state is actually an enabling, but also an restricting institution, enabling the development of homosexuality, but also through its various penal codes, constraining its development. The second one is the market economy, which actually have a very strong impact on the formation of gay identity, especially in Hong Kong in the beginning, and start later in Taiwan, and finally in mainland. And finally, it's the civil society. From here, in this paper, I mainly focus on public culture, especially talk about the role of public intellectual, and also to talk about the family. Okay. Well, but at the end, I think like, you know, what I'm trying to do in this paper, like, is not just talk about the Tongji history in these three different locales, but how to situate it in a more broader like debate. I would say my work is part of like the decolonization sexualities program, because we have to understand and acknowledge that sociology in general and queer theory in particular is really like a Eurocentric narrative of modernity. Okay, so when you talk about like Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, or you talk about like Marx, Foucault, and Butler, they are all Eurocentric sort of like project of modernity. Okay, so we have to understand that, and then we have to try to find a way to get away from it. But then for me, I don't think like, you know, we can totally like, you know, to talk about like a separationist approach, because this is not really appropriate in the sense because like the so-called the West actually has been entered to the history of our, you know, our own experiences. So what we have to try to do is actually to be more critically to evaluate the merits, but also to be more critical to applying and then the understanding of it. So that's why like I would like my transnational queer sociological approach to be part of the project of decentering the Western form of universal knowledges in social sciences and also in sociology. There are actually a lot of like scholars working on this area. But finally, I don't know, it's like what our budget, you know, to talk about how we can actually cultivate that reciprocal listening. Because I think this is not very easy, you know, because like there's a very clear and equal relation between so-called Western and then the non-Western knowledge production. But sometimes I don't really know, like for some Western scholars, they are either ignorant or they're more arrogant in the sense like it's only like a one-way traffic that we can actually understand more about like their theory rather than they listening to our ideas, our theories, and our experiences. So I think our budget talking about this notion of reciprocal listening, I think is very crucial to be cultivated, and so to generate a more meaningful discussion among the West and the East. And so thank you very much for my presentation.